Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Yarmouth Board of Selectmen meeting of April 24th, 2018. I'm going to ask that we all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance and to continue to rise upon the completion for a moment of silence for Sergeant Sean Gannon. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I'm going to start the meeting with a few comments before we start, and I'll ask the other board members if they'd like to make any additional comments before we go to public. Friends and Town of Yarmouth residents, like many of you, I'm full of emotions with the horrific loss of Sergeant Sean Gannon and the events of the last few days. Some of those emotions are conflicted. I'm so very proud of our town, and I always am, but these last few days and weeks have tested the fabric and character of our community, and we have prevailed in that regard. We have seen evil, and we have seen such goodness as well. As we begin to heal, please do not forget the Yarmouth Police Department and their families in the coming days and months ahead as they start to put pieces back together and go on. Imagine everyone goes away and they go back to work, being the remarkable professionals that they are, and they will go about responding to our calls for help in spite of their broken souls and hearts. Please pray for them and their safety. Let us harness our sadness and anger and turn it into something that will affect positive change in the world around us so that Sean's death is not in vain. Please help by using your voice to affect these changes so it does not happen again. We cannot allow it. No mother should bury their child, especially on our watch. Never in all my years of public service has our responsibility been so enormous. We will be okay. It will take time, but we will be together. I cannot thank everyone enough, especially all the other towns that covered the shifts and/or showed up to support our police department. So many thank yous are needed. For the Yarmouth Police Department, you are all amazing. Our hearts are with you. Thank you to the amazing police chief, as well as the entire leadership team for all you have done and continue to do. Thank you to the fire department for all you did for your brothers and sisters in blue. To Pat Armstrong, to Dan Knappich for the school district, to elected officials throughout the state and the Cape that reached out to show their respect and support. The Mass State Police, especially Jim Plath, for everything you did to help us through. Thank you to the vet staff for caring for Nero, and Peter McClellan for never leaving his side. For the nurses, the grief counselors, and the strength, we pray for your strength as you help our men and women heal. Thank you to the business community for your outpouring of support, the Chamber of Commerce. Just basically to everybody. People have really pulled together and pulled through, and I'm awful proud. And I want to say thank you to the Gannon family for sharing Sean with us. Like Sean lived, I ask you to please be the change in this world you want to see. And the only other thing I'd like to add is we received a letter recently that kind of, I'm going to read it because it talks a little bit about some of the things behind the scenes that we haven't heard about Sean, but it's from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Office of Elder Affairs. And it says, Post and members of the board, I'm writing on behalf of the Massachusetts Executive Office of Elder Affairs on our heartfelt condolences for the family, friends, and colleagues of the people of Yarmouth for the loss of Officer Sean Gannon. While Officer Gannon's contributions to Yarmouth were well known to its resident, it may not be aware of his pioneering role to improve the safety of older adults and people with dementia throughout Massachusetts. In 2004, our agency formed a partnership with the Massachusetts State Police and the Police Association of Chiefs Police Association to enroll people at risk for wandering in their local police so that they may be quickly located and returned safely to their homes. Officer Gannon, along with Chief Frederickson and Kathy Bailey of the Yarmouth Council on Aging, were among the first volunteers to develop and promote this program. His hard work served as a strong example to other communities, consulting with the Executive Office of Elder Affairs as they have developed their own registries of people at risk for wandering. Massachusetts was truly fortunate to have such a committed public servant and one whose contributions on behalf of some of the most vulnerable residents will remain part of his enduring legacy. So I think that kind of gives a snapshot of who he was and what he meant to our community. It was just one of the many letters, but I wanted to share that. If anybody else from the board has anything else to add.
I got to thinking after the events of last week, and I went through the agendas of 2010, and I found the agenda that had Sergeant Gannon's appointment. And I went online to find the video. The video wasn't available, so I asked Sean McGinnis to send it to me. And I watched as he was introduced by then Deputy Police Chief Frederickson. And you know, he was just a kid. And I got to thinking that I can't honestly say that I ever saw him again. And if I did, I didn't know who he was. And I also can't honestly say that there are more than a handful of police officers and firemen, too, that I know by sight and by name well enough to say hi. And I really wish that were different. You know, I know that we are often at odds over contracts, but somehow we always get through it. But I wish there were a way that we could know these people better. You know, we've got 65 guys on the police department, and for me to be able to say that I know more than a handful, that's unfortunate. So if there's anything we can do to get to know our public safety officers better, I'd like to investigate that, because I think that we should. And so that's really all I have to say. Thank you.
This has been a very difficult time for our community, and Tracy, thank you for your comments. I can't really add a lot more based on my feelings. I know I spent an awful lot of sleepless hours in the days afterward, and I didn't know Sean, but I just felt so badly for not only him but his family, and so thanks again for your comments. Thank you,
Norm. I think one of the things that I talked about, because I guess I didn't realize the significance. I know how I felt. I didn't realize the impact on the community until I was really out and about after the events. And, you know, the comments from people have been really remarkable. So in terms of trying to help go forward, obviously I know probably a lot of you since I wrote those few words a few days ago, some things have changed. We're making progress on a few fronts. They're looking at different funding. They're looking at a judicial hearing. But I think at some point for our healing as a community, when Chief is ready in our legislative delegation, I think that we should all come together and have a community forum and have kind of a discussion and let people talk, and maybe we can answer some questions. It's far too early now, but I just wanted to start the meeting out with those few comments. So we'll get into our agenda items and public comment. Is there anybody who would like to address the board? Rita?
I just want to echo what you just said about the community getting behind the chief. Whatever he wants, we need to stand with him. Anyway.
Thank you, Vita.
That meeting yesterday, it was such a clear picture that we're going like this, and the twain shall never meet, I guess. I don't know. And I honestly don't know what the schedule is where you need to kick in. Is it anywhere before the election, the special election, or whatever it is that, where you need to have an idea whether or not a new regional agreement will ever come into being? Because Joe has said if you guys, the two towns, don't get together, he's moving along on whatever the schedule is from MSBA, and he'll just use the existing agreement. And I don't know whether I wonder if there might have been perhaps a somewhat better communication between him and certainly the town of Yarmouth, especially when things broke down with Dennis. And I don't, as I said, I don't know what the schedule is, but I think something needs to come to a head. And I appreciated your comments yesterday, both yours, Tracy, and Norm's. Because we need to get this thing off the dime in one way or another, I guess. And Dennis is obviously not being very. They apparently postponed another meeting of that subcommittee, right? And so I think we have to find a way of somehow to get them to tell in public what exactly they expect to do and by what date or what have you. I mean, I think we just need to, we can't continue with this, constant not knowing and canceling meetings and where we stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Vita. Mr. Stephen, sorry.
Congratulations on those words. I think everybody feels the same thing. And if anything good can come out of this, it's that we all gather a sense of community and work together to do what's right for the community. Along those lines, I'm here to advocate for the Green Communities Act, which will go forward if we can agree on the stretch code being passed by the town. Information is always a good thing, except when it's bad information. My understanding is, and it's been backed up by information, that the stretch code only applies to new buildings and new construction over 100,000 square feet. All it is going to do is fund grants that will enable the town of Yarmouth to receive money. The town of Yarmouth has so far gone, there are 5 requirements to meet the Green Communities Act. We have completed or are en route to completing 4 of them. The 5th one that we have to move on is the stretch code. Stretch code is not that different now from the building code, and it does not make buildings airtight. I mean, that's ridiculous, and it is not a tax. It's funded from the Department of Resources. I just believe that the stretch code is important. It will enable the town of Yarmouth to become part of the Green Communities Act and join over 260 other cities and towns in the Commonwealth that are enabled or can receive grant funds. Thank you.
Thank you. Phil.
It's the first time I've ever spoken during the public comments portion of the meeting. I want to thank you for what you said. If I was to start talking about the last 2 weeks, the experiences, the emotions, the reflections, I'd still be talking in 3 hours. So I just want to share one thing with you. We had officers from all over the country, even from Canada. The day after the funeral, I met with 3 officers from Aurora, Colorado. They belong to an organization called Support the Fallen. So they've done this before. And what they told me is that they've never seen a community like this. They were just overwhelmed with the support from everybody, from the merchants, the people in the hospitality business, the people standing beside the street. So we very much appreciate the support and the outpouring from the community.
Thank you, Phil. You guys are going to need it long into the future. So I hope it continues. It is an awful event and something yet to be proud of at the same time. I agree. Thank you. Joyce.
Joyce Flynn. I just wanted to suggest that we move forward as a town for the good of the town, using a finite thing, the stretch code passage, because that will enable us to get a lot of funds for helping the energy efficiency infrastructure of the town improve. I guess I especially thought of it because there had been such problems with the police station over the years, and Georgia Lear worked so hard trying to bring the different systems that were from one contractor who left and disappeared, and then another contractor and another contractor with the HVAC systems. And we know already the amount of the first grant that we would receive for the town, and we'd be in a very good position to receive hundreds of thousands of dollars of competitive grants over the years. 217 plus towns have joined the Green Community Act, so it's not a very startling thing. And I think it's one of the things that might help the town, not just with its infrastructure and improving that, but also with town finances. Because if you have to improve an HVAC system, if you have to do something with a fleet that could be covered by the Green Community Act, then you have that money available for something else. I'd also like to point out that the handout I gave a very long 3 weeks ago, I've put an edited version of that which gives better information on the low-income housing, and that's in the final 3 pages of tonight's packet for Board of Selectmen and for anyone who would like to read that before town meeting. Thank you.
Tom.
Good evening, Madam Chair. Tom Nicanol from Bass River. Just to give you a little up-to-date on our trash day we had the other day, which was Earth Day, which our annual cleanup day. We had a record amount of volunteers come out, and I hope they're all listening to hear this, because we're having a nice volunteer breakfast for those volunteers that do participate on our boards and committees on May 2nd at St. Pius Life's Church. And we had almost 2 tons of trash that we picked up here in our community. And as Julie noted, that's more than last year. So I think as that goes forward, we may hopefully progressively get better next year. And on another note, our Department of Public Works had an open house during a snow season, a snow event last month, and the turnout was okay, but I understand they're having another one the 28th of April from 1 to 3. So we encourage everybody to come out and to look at the Department of Public Works building, which is hopefully going to be slated for an upgrade. And on the last note, your words to Officer Gannon, out of the 351 communities in Massachusetts, Yarmouth is the bottom alphabetically, but we're number 1 now. Thank you very much.
Is there anybody else who would like to address the board? Seeing nobody, we will move into our public hearing items. The first item, not sure.
So change of manager for the moose?
Yeah, I'm just wondering who,
There's no public hearing, no legal ad, no notification of a butters required. The folks from the moose?
yeah, no, I know, I'm just wondering if,
It's not a licensing hearing. You
Okay.
can do it.
all right. So, folks from the Moose, if you'd like to come forward, we have your application. If you'd like to introduce yourself to the board, yes, please sit down. How are you?
Hello, I'm Eric Jocelyn. I was appointed last May as the administrator of the Yarmouth Moose Lodge. And I apologize for just getting it changed over now, because I was never explained when I first took over. During the course of the year, several people in the town has been very helpful and telling me what I need to do.
Okay.
So here I am.
All right, well, we're here now, so that's a good thing. And I noticed that you have your tip certification.
Yes.
And are you familiar with the town's rules and regulations regarding alcohol service and the requirements?
Yes.
And you know that there's, as a manager, you're required to go to annual training, keep logs, and be sure that all of your staff is tips trained as well.
Yes.
This is more of a formality. As they said, it's not a licensing hearing or a public hearing in any way. We just like to see the managers and
Okay.
meet them. Does anybody on the board have any questions?
No.
Is there a motion to approve the change of manager?
So moved. Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you. Good luck. This is Mr. Officer Phil Magnuson. He's our licensing officer at the time. Okay, good, perfect. So they're there to help. Please use them as needed, and good luck. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Officer Magnuson, our next, and Mike should be along shortly. I know we all had, I don't know if you want to go over the, do we want to do is the Bass Hole people here yet? No? Okay. All right. Let me just get to that part. Okay. So some amendments have been offered
Yes.
that are in our packet, and it's kind of been summarized here to the board. Motion to amend and strike different rules and regulations. The first one is to strike a portion of Chapter 60 of the Yarmouth Code entitled Yarmouth Board of Selectmen Acting as the Local Licensing Authority Rules and Regulations. And the second change is to strike Chapter 155 of the Yarmouth Town Code entitled Yarmouth Liquor Regulations, and replace it with the Yarmouth Board of Selectmen Acting as a Licensing Authority Rules and Regulations, Chapter 155 of the Yarmouth Town Code, dated 3/1/18. So if you want to just talk about those changes, the impotence for the change, and what it means.
Sure, let me talk about the first part in cleaning up the codification problem. We've been treating the rules and regulations as Chapter 60 of the Yarmouth Town Code, which it has been in my book for quite some time. It was brought to my attention and confirmed by Mr. Cardet that we have another Chapter 155, which had a different set of regulations, and his sense was that these regulations belong in Chapter 155 because that's the portion of the Yarmouth Town Code where regulations are as opposed to bylaws. So I've run this change through him, and he agrees that we should get rid of the old Chapter 60 and insert the amended regulations, which used to be Chapter 60, as Chapter 155. So we're trying to clean up a little bit of a historical glitch there. Now, we've also taken the regulations which were Chapter 60, which we revised back in 2016, and really made some small changes. A lot of it's a little bit of tweaking to address some unforeseen issues and clean up some language. And I'd be happy to run through some of the changes if you'd like. I do want to point out that we had a meeting, a workshop meeting with representatives of the Yarmouth Restaurant Association and the restaurant business. We had 27 people attend on February 12th. We discussed the changes, and folks were pretty much in agreement as to them. We didn't have any opposition, any specific opposition to any of the proposed changes. Perhaps the most important change is an amendment, and I've given the board a red line
Yes, I like
copy
that.
so you can
Thank
see
you.
the changes. And I guess I could go through them. We've deleted the provision that the rules and regulations be kept at the front desk to simplify the record keeping, so the rules and regulations should be kept together with the model policy, and a single piece of paper can be used for the sign-off sheet This is partly as a result of experience with visits where people tell us that the tip certificates are in the employees' files, and they have to go dig through them to find out if somebody's qualified or not. And also input from the Restaurant Association that there's too much paperwork and it's scattered in too many places. So we would ask that if these records be kept together, and employees could sign off with a single sign-off sheet that they had reviewed both the town rules and regulations and the model policy.
And where, Officer Magnuson, where is that requirement? I see that you struck the requirement for it to be at the front door, but the addition in the terms of basically what you're asking for is a single
Go
binder.
forward to section 109.
Oh, it's in a separate section.
109A through
Okay.
C.
I see it now, I'm sorry.
And so we
Yep.
took it out of that, it was scattered throughout the rules and regulations. We tried to put it all in one place. So in that one spot, the restaurants or anybody with an alcohol license would keep the employee list, any training certificates that are required, the policy on alcohol service, rules and regulations, and have a single document to record employee review of both the alcohol policy and the rules and regulations. So that's kind of a cleanup amendment. The other one is a little more substantive. It's a requirement that the manager be physically present adequately to fulfill his statutory duties. The manager under Section 26 is in charge of all the alcohol-related business on the premises. We've had several instances where we've never seen the manager. The manager's off Cape, even out of state. And we never had a requirement that they be physically present. We didn't put an hour requirement or a time requirement, just that the manager be there some period of time sufficient to address his statutory duties. The next amendment is in Section 107D. It's to clarify under the happy hour regulations, which are the regulations restricting alcohol service. In there it says that a licensee can offer free entertainment. Well, we're merely putting in there that the licensee can only offer entertainment if they have an entertainment license. You may recall a hearing where the licensee said, well, I thought I didn't need an entertainment license because it said that in the happy hour regulations. Another change is to clean up a drafting oversight that's my responsibility, and that has to do with the biannual seminar. When we fixed the rate, when we first drafted the regulations requiring that folks come to the seminar, I said they had to come in 2016 and every other year thereafter. Well, my oversight was that it doesn't address people who get licenses after 2016. So what we've merely said is that for a new manager, a new licensee, they need to come to the first available after they get their new license, and then every other year, just to clean up that ambiguity. In Section 2 in the entertainment license in paragraph A, we had a provision in there, and it's been in there forever, that said that the entertainment license requirement does not apply to private functions such as wedding receptions where the event is not open to the public and there's no charge for admission. And again, we heard about that at a recent hearing. And looking at the state law, there's no basis for that in the state law. The purpose for entertainment license is for the convenience and peace of the public, how the entertainment might affect the public. So that doesn't square with state law. How that provision got in there, I don't know, but Mr. Stone and I felt that it was important to strike that provision. And finally, in Section 4 on package stores, particularly Mr. Stone did not feel it was clear enough in the regulations that package store licensees also needed to attend the annual compliance seminar. It was implied elsewhere, but was not explicit. So we've put a paragraph L in to contain that requirement. And the final change is that we've added a Section 10, and this came from the Yarmouth Restaurant Association. And let me say that in the last couple of years, the Restaurant Association and many people in the industry have really become partners in improving our service, raising standards, and reducing problems. And this was a request that they made to make suggestions, not requirements, but merely good practice suggestions for the people who hold licenses. And again, that they train and retrain their staff, that they keep good records, that they purchase the current ID checking guide, so they have guidance for out-of-state and even Massachusetts licenses, that they communicate with the public, let the community know that they're part of the solution, and also to put up posters in their time clock area or in their locker area, simple training posters to just remind the people who work there of the things that they need to be aware of. So we thought that this was a good recommendation. Again, they're recommendations only, they're not requirements, but I think it's a good step for us to take.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
So, does this draft substitute for 155?
What we're doing is we're deleting 155, we're deleting 60, and we're replacing 155 with this draft.
Okay.
What we actually had was two different sets of regulations that were inconsistent. We're trying to get them consistent in one place and in the right place.
So if we vote, we have to vote to remove 155 then,
Yes.
and then separately vote to enact a new
Enact this and to
new
delete
155.
Chapter 60 as well.
Okay.
And I've discussed this with the town clerk, and he agrees that this is the way to resolve the situation.
Okay. Mark, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
Dan?
No.
I thought you had something you wanted to say.
No, I think what Officer Magnuson's referring to, there's a couple motions, like right in the beginning.
Right.
That would address that issue.
But I read it to start as a,
Yes, and I unfortunately did not
Oh,
read
I
my
see. Oh,
perfect. No, we have it. Eric, do you have any questions?
You know, my only comment was, it seems as though this is just tidying up things that we've been enforcing for a couple of years.
It really is.
Yeah, so.
The only real change is about requiring the managers to be physically present. And you may recall, a couple of problems we have been establishments where we never saw the managers.
So I'll make a motion to strike that portion of Chapter 60 of the Yarmouth Code entitled Yarmouth Board of Selectmen Acting as the Local Licensing Authority Rules and Regulations.
second.
Any discussion on that? All those in favor?
Aye.
I'll make sorry.
Okay.
I'll make another motion to strike Chapter 155 of the Yarmouth Town Code entitled Yarmouth Liquor Regulations and replace with the following. Yarmouth Board of Selectmen acting as Yarmouth Licensing Authority Rules and Regulations, Chapter 155 of the Yarmouth Town Code dated March 1st, 2018.
Second.
Any discussion on that motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
That would have taken so much.
We're all set? Okay. So the next item on our agenda is the Bass Hole Beach update. We're right back on time. This is great.
Yeah, that would have taken an hour and a half easy if my.
He would have had a hearing. All right. Good evening.
Good evening. Does each of the select persons have the package?
We have a
I think so.
presentation in our packet, as well as, I guess, well, there's a PowerPoint up on the board that we can follow.
And if anybody would like to follow on, there's the handouts that'll mimic the PowerPoint presentation.
Hi, Carl. Good evening.
Good evening.
How are you?
Good, thank you.
If you'd like to introduce yourself and your guests here tonight.
Absolutely. My name is Carl Von Hoen, Director of the Division of Natural Resources for the record. With me is Dave Bennett. He's the project manager from Bennett Environmental Associates, Inc., as well as Arlene Wilson, who is the wetland specialist.
Okay.
The project that you're going to be hearing about was initiated approximately, well, a little bit over a year ago by Bob Lawton when he was interim town manager, anyways. Titles keep getting changed. And what we were doing is taking a look at Bass Hole Beach The area that has historically been used as a bathing beach is being encroached with salt marsh vegetation. So Bennett has been hired to take a look at some of the alternatives that we may be able to look at moving forward.
Okay.
If I may just add to that, there was a solicitation that went out, a request for proposal, and Dave Bennett's firm responded to the solicitation, and that's how we got here tonight.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and good evening, Madam Chairman, Honorable Selectmen, Mr. Manager, Mr. Administrator, I guess, Town Administrator. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dave Bennett, and I'm joined here by Arlene, as Carl has represented, and we're here tonight to kind of update you on where we are on the project, and to get to the point where we represent some alternatives that we have for various solutions to the problems that were framed in the RFP. And then we will go through the matrix of that evaluation as the basis of our recommendations. So, is there anything we can do with the focus of that, or is that as good as it gets?
That is likely the resolution of your presentation.
Well, I knew it'd be me.
Under the chair.
I'll give you 10.
That's all right. If everybody, I think, has a package, and you may be absolutely true. I know that there were some definition problems with some of these slides. So, to date, what we have done is we've had various meetings with agents of the town of Yarmouth, the Mass DEP, to try to outline what specifically are the boundaries for this investigation. And the response is really, it's framed around trying to protect the narrow stretch of beach that exists at Bass Hole. And that is what's shown in the center of this picture. So the project objectives were to evaluate the existing conditions in the context of the historic work that has been there, and to characterize the use such that the use could be further enhanced by the users of the beach, and also to evaluate the degree of permitting difficulty, the likelihood of success in achieving the objective to maintain this section of beach, and to then consider other aesthetics and/or safety issues that we think are important. During part of this discussion, the mucky bottom factor was explained to us, that once you get to a certain point on the beach, you go over what I would term a mud line, and you get into very soft sediments. Also spoke to other parties that were concerned that this beach is now being used to access not Sandy Neck, but Chapin's Beach by visitors walking across the sand flats at low tide and then being stranded there. So some of these issues kind of drove us looking kind of outside the box and beyond just the beach for other things that were readily implemented, very inexpensive, and we thought would be very effective. So before we go too much further, and some of these features here are going to be better explained throughout the presentation, but here we have a picture of Gray's Beach, which is at the end of Center Street. And this is a historic site. You can see the beach itself is this sand here. You cannot see as well the encroaching salt marsh, but we have some better pictures that will show that. The dune area here, which appears to be heavily heavy foot traffic for access to the beach, so we think that resource area and that traffic is something that we wanted to address. When we were looking at the parking area that is some distance away from the beach, and the restroom facilities that are even further away from the beach, to kind of make this functional and usable while protecting the natural resources. I do have to say, of course, this is the boat basin and the boardwalk that actually goes out to Gray's Beach, which I mistakenly termed Bass Hole Beach for the first 2 months until I was reminded that it is actually Bass Hole Beach. So one of the things that really came out to us right away is this is an older facility that is laid out over a large area. And although I'm sure that it functions for the bathers to get to the beach, we really characterize it as a bathing beach more than a swimming beach from the standpoint of the depths of water and the area that's available for the swimmers. We also looked at the boat ramp and realized that this was generally used by people with smaller craft. This is not a deep water access. I don't think this is considered a primary, landing for fishing, although I'm sure there's a lot of shell fishing and other boating activities. But I would say in general, these are either small horsepower boats or wind or paddle-driven craft. You will see in this picture there's some sand flats out here, and I think this is a really good segue because one of the things that became very obvious to us from the very beginning, even before we submitted the RFP, was that this was a project that at its face was counter to the interest of the Wetlands Protection Act, wherein to make this beach and access to Chase Garden Creek along this narrow line of beach between these two sections of salt marsh, which are all around us, we would have to try to hold back the natural processes, and that's counter to the act. So we have to hold paramount the use of the beach for public access and recreation in order to counteract the interest of the act with regards to letting natural processes proceed. So with that, I think I'd like to turn the section of this presentation over to Arlene, who's going to speak about the history and the natural processes that are that kind of framed our alternatives. And then she will go through the 5 alternatives that we considered. I will then take over in the matrix evaluation of what the cost and benefit and feasibility of each one of these alternatives is.
So it's important to understand at least a little bit of the physical processes that are going on here in order to evaluate some of the alternatives that might be employed. Bass Hole Beach is at the confluence of 2 longshore drift systems, one that runs east to west across the north shore of Chapin Beach and causes that beach to elongate and curve toward Bass Hole Beach, and the other that runs from west to east, essentially from Mill Pond all the way to Bass Hole. The sand systems are interrupted by Clay Creek on the west and Chase Garden Creek on the east. All of these things coming together make a very complex sand deposition system, and they contribute to the formation and enlargement of the sand flats that are just to the north of the bathing beach. We also need to know a little bit of the history of what's going on here. This area, as I know quite a number of you know, and probably better than I, has been a site for access to the water since the inception of the town. Essentially, there were dockage facilities at the end of Center Street, and the interesting pieces of history show that there have been human interventions from the mid-1700s here. People would go and dredge out, then mostly by hand, the areas where the boats docked to make sure that there was enough depth of water. In the 17 and 1800s, Chapin Beach wasn't nearly as long as it is now. The end of Chapin was essentially where what was called the ARC facilities, the shellfish, now county shellfish growing facility is located. And so Bass Hole was open wide to the bay, and the currents from the bay and the tidal flux from the bay tended to keep it open. Subsequently, in 1911, the Thatchers gave money for the first of the boardwalks. That's probably the longest boardwalk that was ever built here, and it extended with a bridge across Clays Creek to the opposite side of the creek, where there was a beautiful sandy beach located in front of the salt marsh. That beach extended across what became the town properties all the way to the current boat landing and ramp. But interestingly, based on aerial photography, not to where the beach is today. In the 1950s or so, there were a series of significant hurricanes and northeast storms. They apparently took away almost all of the remaining sand on the north side of that long strip of salt marsh. In the absence of that sand, the town apparently decided that they would create a bathing beach. And town meeting voted money to excavate through the salt marsh at the location of the current bathing beach. As far as we can tell, this project did not have permits either, and unfortunately didn't dredge quite deeply enough. So although it took away a big piece of salt marsh, it didn't take away all of the peat sediments. As Chapin Beach elongated and the flats grew in front of it, there became a tendency to deposit fine sediment where the salt marsh was formerly, and the remaining root mat started to grow back in because nature abhors a vacuum and wants to bring that marsh back. So now we've got to a point where the bathing beach, the access to the water is quite narrow. In looking at alternatives, because what we're really trying to do here is to stop natural processes, very difficult to do, not often successful. And we have to look at a number of alternatives, starting with the alternative that all of the permitting agencies always ask you first. What happens if you don't do anything? So the first alternative is always do nothing. In this case, and I would point out that we look at it this way because all of the area that the town owns are classified as one or another resource area under the Wetlands Protection Act. And therefore, it's really not possible to do much of anything without at least some permits. The bigger the project, the more permits you need, the more difficult it is to get them, and the longer it takes. So in addition to the flats that we've talked about before and the salt marsh, there's shellfish and finfish habitat. Mass Natural Heritage, which is the wildlife agency, classifies all of this as potential habitat for creatures of concern, mostly seabirds here, but also turtles and some other animals. And then you've got the dunes, and everything is land subject to coastal storm flowage. So all of those things run into the mix.
So everything in this slide that is outlined in that greenish color is a designated resource area, wetlands resource area. And the entirety of the site is within a flood zone. And I think that next picture.
That one.
And I know this had poor resolution, but again, all those colors, green, purple, blue, designate the flood zones that are in this area. And we are up in this area, I think, right in here.
Move on to number one. So in this case, the do-nothing alternative really isn't quite do-nothing. It would mean that the town would periodically continue beach nourishment above mean high water, which is something you've been doing now. With luck, you would also kind of reorganize the access from the parking lot to the beach to eliminate the sort of wandering through the dune area that goes on. That would help stabilize the dune, help it to grow and protect the areas that are somewhat more landward. Because this alternative only needs a permit from the local conservation commission, it's quick, it's relatively inexpensive, and the chances of success are about 99%. But it doesn't save the bathing beach, and we would estimate that at the current rate of recolonization for the salt marsh, in something between 20 and 25 years, the salt marsh would have closed in except for a pedestrian path that people would be cutting back and forth through it. And so the place where people were sitting on the sand and picnicking and sunbathing would be really isolated from the place where you could get your feet wet. Probably not very good in terms of saving the recreational capacity of the area, although your boating facility would probably be unaffected. The second alternative, you want to run through those slides?
Sure.
The second alternative is starting at the wish list end of the spectrum, the end that would be the most difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. And that would be to cut or a dredge through the sandbar to open up the bathing beach. What that would do is, because it would increase the tidal range and velocities where the salt marsh is now, the salt marsh would probably be reduced through attrition, essentially. However, this dredging project would be considered new or improvement dredging. The Corps of Engineers in particular has decided that improvement dredging is not a good thing. They're very resistant to giving permits for that kind of work. It would require an enormous study for littoral drift to see how the dredging would impact not only the town properties, but Dennis properties. It would involve trying to reroute the secondary channels from Chase Garden Creek from the Yarmouth shore to the Dennis shore. And I can tell you that I've recently spoken with some of the staffers in Dennis who tell me that the Dennis thought about trying to do this so that they could take the sand and put it on Chapin Beach, where Chapin Beach has a terrible erosion problem. They got such pushback from the agencies that they actually dropped the alternative in terms of their study altogether. Even if you could get a permit, we would estimate it would take at least 3 to 5 years. It would need periodic maintenance dredging, maybe on a 10-year basis, and your chances of permitting, I would estimate at about 30% after all that time and money. A second is to stabilize the beach with jetties. One jetty on the easterly shore where the shoreline goes to the north and then around Chase Garden Creek, and the other probably on the west side of the town dock. You wouldn't want it inside the town dock because it would catch a lot of sand and you'd wind up dredging the docking facilities all the time. You would have the same, or be looking for the same impact on the salt marsh, because the salt marsh would become sediment starved. It would generally become a little bit reduced through attrition. But it also would create a situation where you would need to nourish the bathing beach more frequently, because its source of sand would also be held back by those jetties. Again, permitting for new jetties has become significantly more difficult in the last couple of years. We would estimate your permitting time for this at 2 or 3 years, and the chance of success at about 50%. The fourth alternative is to relocate the westerly section of salt marsh altogether. You'd come in and cut it out just as though you were cutting out turf, and move it to the area between the boat ramp and the dock, where the salt marsh is currently significantly degraded. So you actually wouldn't lose the overall amount of salt marsh that you would have. Then you would probably need to dredge a little bit deeper than people have in the past to get rid of the organic material that's there, which would retard the regrowth of the salt marsh. Cover that area back up with sand to something like a natural slope to give a nice aesthetic feel underfoot for the bathing beach area. The problem with this is that doing anything to salt marsh is an absolute nightmare under the Wetlands Protection Act. It actually requires a variance from the commissioner. To the best of my knowledge, since the inception of the Wetlands Protection Act in its current form, about 1978 for coastal processes, there have only been 2 appeals granted. And so this is also a very long-term permitting situation, probably 4 or 5 years, with a 25% chance of success. The final alternative that we looked at is actually marsh containment. It proposes washover bulkheads, that is a short vertical bulkhead, the top of which would be essentially even with the salt marsh sediment, run on the interior sides of those salt marsh patches. So it would define what's now the bathing beach, contain the salt marsh from spreading by root action. We would suggest, but it wouldn't be required, to dredge out the remaining peat and soft sediments in the opening and then backfill with sand. Again, getting rid of those peat sediments means that there's nothing to catch the seed from the salt marsh, and it would keep it from sort of re-entering the cut over time. You would need to continue doing periodic beach nourishment, maybe a 10-year cycle, we would estimate, depending on how much activity there actually is at the beach. You would lose that sand predominantly to foot traffic underwater. With luck, it'd get pushed back in on the incoming tide, but you'd still need to augment it over time. Permitting for this kind of thing is easier, probably take about 2 years. We would estimate about an 85% chance of success. It would hold the life of the existing bathing beach opening probably for 30 to 50 years, although you'd still be doing interim maintenance on the bulkhead itself. And as I said, a little bit of periodic beach nourishment.
All right, so just to kind of rehash what we've talked about was the do-nothing strategy is not a do-nothing strategy. As part of our recommendation to you, the issues of public access to the beach and a safe and designated area is something that we are recommending as a part of any of the alternatives. We currently have a walkway that goes to a viewing stand, which is basically the launching pad for the public to walk over the dune area onto the beach. So we think that any alternative, including the do-nothing alternative, would want to address that. A second issue that we looked at is that there's some expressed concerns, and I would share those concerns of safety. And we would like to see some additional posting to protect the town of Yarmouth against any liability for anybody going beyond what is effectively the control of the lifeguard, and certainly to, at their own risk, go beyond that designated area if they wish to go and travel to Chapin's Beach. A third issue, and I'm not sure that this is something that we can do much about, is that it appears to me that the restrooms that are here are a very, very long way from the beach, and I would suggest that there might be some portable sanitary facilities provided in the parking lot so that it's at least reasonable to think that they would be used. I think if the distance is so great from the beach, I think we chance that there may be some undesirable conditions that result as a lack of sanitary facilities. So the second one was the sandbar modification. That was an extensive dredging program. The third was the stabilization of the beach with jetties. The fourth was the relocation of the salt marsh, and the fifth was the containment with bulkheads. So what I did in order to put this in the context of your purview, because we would like some guidance from the Selectmen tonight as to which alternative we'd like to proceed, we created this metrics evaluation which uses permitting time, the ability to meet the project objectives, and the project costs as matrices for which this evaluation is. So if you, and I can go through the estimated time, low being blue, that means that it's a permit within a year. Green means permits within 1 to 3 years. The likelihood of a longer time for the permitting process of taking more than 3 years is in red. So the estimated likelihood of success in the construction and meeting the objective of holding back the beach with the information that we have right now, is high. That would mean that it would be 70% or more certain to make some improvement to the access to the Chase Garden Creek. Medium would be 30 to 70%, and low would be less than 30%. And then we also did some cost projections where the blue represents low cost up to 500,000. The green is medium cost, 500 to 2 million, and high is over $2 million. So you can see from just this matrix that there's a couple of things here that just don't really seem to make sense with the amount of budget that is in the engineering and design and permitting phase of this. Typically, engineering costs represent 10% of the construction cost. So at the current, RFP at 28,000, this is a project that, we suspect is going to be $500,000 or less without additional studies. So the do nothing scored quite well, but as I said, the do nothing is not do nothing, and there is an alternative to the do nothing, which I think bears some consideration. Presently, the town, through the dredging permit for Bass River, is allowed to dump those dredge spoils on this beach, but that is only above the high water mark. That does not address the intertidal zone and that area which is the access way, because quite frankly, it's well below the high water mark and really kind of exists at mean sea level. I believe that that would have a benefit to this issue of footing and covering the substrate such that the salt marsh did not reestablish as quickly as possible. We also think that there's additional merits to the containment with the bulkheads, and the reason for that is that it has a reasonable permitting time. It has it would meet the objectives, particularly if we included the dredging, but I want to caution you about including the dredging in the primary design phase of this. Without the dredging, it actually comes into a medium to low cost, and it comes to a medium to low cost, which is shown here. But meeting the project objectives, we think, even without the removal and dredging of the material in between, would be at a medium level that would extend the life of that opening, I think, as Arlene has represented, beyond this natural attenuation of 15 to 25 years to 25 to 50 years. So what we're looking at, or what we are recommending, is either option one modified to, or is including the recommendations to protect against pedestrian access to the beach from the dune, either through an elevated walkway, which would be an extension of the existing walkway, or to create a marked path that runs along the side of the roadway for which the boat ramp is accessed. We think that signs could be posted and fencing provided otherwise to make sure that people are not using anything other than the designated path, and that there should be signs posted with regards to swimming beyond a certain distance from the lifeguard stand, which would put citizens at their own risk. The number 5 with the bulkheads is our actual recommendation as based on these matrices. And I want to go back to revisit the issue of dredging or not dredging. When we first met, I think this meeting would speak words, with Kelly and Carl at the site, we also invited Steve McKenna, who is the Mass DEP representative for waterways in this area. And we had talked about, sheet piling and dredging this area out because even early on in the study, it looked like it was the preferred alternative from our knowledge of both the permitting processes and our experience in getting something done at a reasonable cost that'll have a reasonable degree. When I say reasonable, a medium to high degree to extend the life, which is commensurate with the value of the project. So for $500,000, if you're getting 25 years of extra life out of that beach, we think that's a good investment. He warned us at this meeting that we should not attempt to dredge. That either the scenario of relocating the salt marsh and/or excavating and dredging substrate between the two existing salt marshes was probably not a reasonable expectation that those permits would ever be granted. However, he had recommended that as a secondary project at a later date, that would be a much more palatable revision to an existing permit. So I think that that is something that the selectmen and the town should keep in mind in making a decision. That I think that there is a desire for something to happen sooner rather than later, that improvements to public access, the aesthetic nature of it, and a solution that is not counter to the interest, but really kind of corralling the expansion of the salt marsh is a much more palatable idea, and really does then accentuate the public access and water use dependent nature of the beach. So I think that is something that we would like to see. And I end here and open it up for discussions with an example of what a low-profile washover bulkhead would be. So this would be a man-made material or steel. In speaking to the manufacturer's reps, they are convinced that the man-made material, which is recycled material, would survive this in the ice action, because the ice action there, as you know, damaged the boardwalk. When we first went out there, it was like something out of, the adventures of to the North Pole. So we have to look at the resistance, but this, as lined by piles, would line both areas in a kind of a semicircle, matching the existing salt marsh geometry. And then it would also provide, the cap's not shown here, but there are various types of cap that can be used that are man-made or, natural. I think the man-made caps, from an issue of people sitting on it or otherwise using it, because I quite frankly think this creates a feature for this beach. This would approximately be from the existing grade to no more than 2 feet out above the grade at low tide, encircling the marsh, and so it creates an area where people can kind of sit and put their feet in the water. Kids can put their trucks on top of it or whatever they do, and put their, build their sandcastles on top of it. It also allows an opportunity to, place buoys or other signage at that limit that you want to prescribe as bathers not going on or outside of the control of the town. And I think that this is something that we can get done, and we can get done in the budget without the dredging in the $500,000 area. with permits that would likely to be granted within 12 months of the approval of the local Conservation Commission through the Waterways Review. I'll be happy to answer any questions. I know we've gone over a lot of material very quickly and passed through some slides, so are there any questions?
Thank you. Before we go to questions, Carl, do you have anything, or Carrie? Anything that you want to add?
Looking at what the request was to see what we possibly could do to retain that area of open beach and prevent any further encroachment of the salt marsh, you know, was very clear to us when it was presented by the board. And that proved to be very difficult, looking at what the alternatives are with this area. In a previous meeting, I voiced my concerns, very similar, with the permitting capabilities and the likelihood of getting permits to do some of these actions. I think the retaining wall is ambitious, thinking that we'll be able to get it done in a short period of time. I don't believe there really is any or many examples in the Commonwealth of this being done to retard the expansion of the salt marsh. I do have some concerns with ice damage. Anybody that was down there this winter seeing the large blocks of ice well past where this wall would be, I think it would be a continual maintenance component. The reason we are unable to do nourishment below the mean high water mark on the north side of Bass Hole under our 10-year dredging permit and beach nourishment permits was just that, the concerns that the permitting agencies had on putting additional alterations that close to the salt marsh that was there. For the nourishment that we're able to do, we can do it above mean high water, but it also needs to be a minimum of 10 feet away from the salt marsh. So I think we still are going to have some hurdles moving forward with the salt marsh, continuing the salt marsh. The wall also, the consultants talked about a perforated wall, which would have to be done, or else we would be retaining water back over that salt marsh. That would not be healthy for the salt marsh. But it also creates an alleyway for water to come out. Some of my concern is further erosion of the sand and sediment there as you create almost a rip style drawback of the tide if there's not enough perforations in the wall to allow the tide to subside naturally. Regardless on any wave action that may be coming up and over and during storm events. So I think some additional studies really need to be looked at with this option. I don't disagree that we really should be looking at something, but I don't know what that is, and this was an attempt to look at what has been done elsewhere, having a clean set of eyes look at it. With what some of the options may be. I've worked with the town of Dennis for the last 20 years trying to get them on board to do some dredging and beach nourishment work on the north side there. We're already seeing some shifting in some of the bars. There's a bar that is forming just off the boat ramp, which may shift some of those currents a little bit further out, eroding the outer bar, in turn allowing some sediment to rebuild along the beach. It's such a dynamic area. Anybody that's been there any length of time has seen dramatic changes there. And that bar comes and goes that is out there. Permitting is or would be monumental to try to do some improvement dredging out there. I thought that that would be a good effort for both towns because Dennis could use that sand to help protect Yarmouth by nourishing Chapin Beach. but they don't seem to be on board with trying to move forward with something at this time. Some of the other options, I agree, I think we're going to have such significant pushback from permitting agencies of some of these other options. I don't think the likelihood, as our consultants said, likelihood is very, very low of success with those options. But I do still have some concerns with this low wall, option without additional information and some additional potential studies.
Okay. Thank you, Carl. What is the expected deliverable on this RFP, on the contract with you?
In the, going with the option 2 or 5?
Just in general, what was the?
Well, I think it ranges greatly, depending on the difficulty of the permitting. So within the RFP budget, the only two alternatives are really viable under what information that we have now, albeit that Carl says that we would need to have further studies of the application of a washover bulkhead. I think that we can probably find those. It's certainly not something that is unique. I think it's more used in other states than it is presently here, but it's certainly something we can do. So to answer your question, each one of those alternatives has a different timeline for approval from the permitting standpoint. The design and engineering is not a time-consuming process. Once we have a direction, we can put these plans together relatively quickly. We have the survey mostly completed for this site. We've done all the historic background. And with the input from the various town representatives, I think, and I will stand by it, I think that once we were to get approvals for the washover bulkhead locally, then I think that we would be on a 1-year permitting and 1-year construction timeline, using the off-season, of course, for the construction. So I think that the permitting for that would take place this year, and that potentially at the end of this season, we might be in a position to do something as far as the construction activities.
Okay. Norma, I know this is something that you have a great deal of interest in, so.
Well, certainly, the alternatives are fairly clear. I very honestly don't know what more is going to be discovered through additional studies, but, just delay. Frankly, this I hear a lot about this on a day-to-day basis, and from the community. And certainly can't support the alternatives and that are high risk and low probability of success. But I don't think that doing nothing is appropriate at this point, and I see the deterioration happening more quickly all the time. And I think further delays and further studies will just accelerate that to the point that there'll be very little beach left to retain. I personally feel like we need to move ahead with something like alternative number 5. I'd certainly like to see some other examples of that where it's been installed and so forth. As to the source of funds, I don't know if there are grant funds potentially available for this sort of thing, or what other sources of funding there are.
Eric?
I'd be supportive of option number 5. I think it's probably relatively inexpensive compared to the others. I think 85% chance of success is good enough for me. And I think in concept, it's pretty simple. Put a wall on both sides and carve all the junk out of the middle and add to the beach. Sounds easy. Sounds like you do it in a weekend. I'm not willing to entertain ideas about signs and porta potties and keeping people off the dunes at this time. I don't agree with any of that, but I would be supportive of option number 5 if that was the direction the board wanted to go in.
Yeah, I would offer one additional observation. I understand what's said about the bathrooms, but I don't think the bathrooms at this beach are any further away than they are at most of the other big beaches on the other side. As a matter of fact, I think they're closer to the beach in this case. So, this beach gets a lot of very young kids bathing, not swimming a lot, bathing, but chasing crabs and that sort of thing, and enjoying the area. So, it's subject to whatever choices those little kids make at the beach, and out of the control of their parents. So, you have to kind of deal with that. The saving grace is that there's a 7 or 8 foot change in tide. So at least you get some wash effect from the tidal action.
It gets flushed.
That's right, it gets flushed, literally. I'm not sure that I would support expenditure of funds to do more with the dune area or with the bathrooms at this point.
Mike?
I think the clear choice is alternative number 5, because, as Eric says, it's simple, but what drives me even more than that is the high degree of probability. These other alternatives with 30% likelihood of success after spending a lot of money on permitting over many, many years, which would probably result in further degradation of the beach, doesn't seem to me to have any appeal at all. And aesthetically, the wall, if it's going to look something like what we saw on the screen, I don't think it looks disconsonant with the area at all. I think it's appropriate for that area, and it's aesthetically acceptable.
Mark? Will you finish, Mike?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your presentation, and I think your realistic assessment of the challenges that we face.
We were the only bidder.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. No, I mean, doing projects in this kind of environment with what we're looking at here, very, very difficult, and very difficult to permit, as you well know and understand. I've spent actually 40 years of my life restoring and protecting coastal resources, so I very much appreciate your observations. And I know you've spent many years in this field as well, and I respect your work immensely. I'm interested in looking at the options. I would prefer having the opportunity with staff to actually go to the site and better envision particularly this option number 5. But if I had to vote now, I'd be voting for the do nothing option, quite frankly. I think to some degree, even the assessments on the permitting of number 5 were a bit optimistic.
Through the chair, I do want to make a clarification that the permitting and the timing is based on not including the dredging between the bulkheads as part of the primary strategy. That would be something that I think would be an add-on at a later date, as would be necessitated by need and the evaluation of the effectiveness of these bulkheads. I also think that the placement of sand below the high water mark is something that you want to roll into this permit such that there can be the spreading of the dredge spoils from Bass River to just beyond the high water mark. At the high water mark, there is no beach. There are people sitting in a 5-foot strip or sitting on what is the dune. And I've heard that, there's not a lot of concern about the foot traffic there, but as you would appreciate, the dune is there to stop coastal floodage. And so if that dune didn't have high traffic on it, and if we were to take some measures to try to capture the sand that blows around here, you would actually start to develop a hump there. It would start to actually look like a dune. So that would have the benefit of preventing flooding in the parking lot and at the time of coastal storms. It would provide additional habitat. It has merits because to sell any of this, and many of you may be aware of it, there has to be mitigation. There has to be something that you're doing that offsets any negative impact of the project. So in any scenario, I think that there has to be a representation of mitigation, and that would be to the benefit of the interest of the act and the protection of the resources that are there.
I would also suggest to you, in light of your comment about the probabilities that we assigned here, you know that most of my work is for private clients as opposed to government agencies. And if it were a private client of mine who wanted to protect his beach or her beach and wanted to do something like this, I would tell them that their chances were no better than 50-50. But because the town is a government entity and we have the ability to say that the public benefits here in protecting the bathing beach are as significant, if not more, than the detriments that might be posed by the washover bulkheads. That's what gives the town the edge in terms of the ability to get a permit here.
Would you say that option 5 is consistent with the intent of the Wetlands Protection Act?
No.
Probably not.
Okay.
And again, except that you're a governmental agency.
I understand. So it would be a government agency attempting to do something inconsistent with state law.
And government entities are always given the benefit of the doubt in that kind of a circumstance.
No, I just want to make sure we understand that, because I think to some degree, the agencies themselves look for some consistency in terms of how they apply the law and how they grant waivers and how they deal with matters like this.
And this would, in my experience, and I was a member of the Coastal Advisory Board years and years ago.
I do.
But this is consistent with the way the state, and in particular the Wetlands Division, treats government entities.
Yeah.
I think they recognize the towns have a responsibility to enhance public access to water.
And I think that's clearly the point here. I think that's what the board's interested in exploring, is what can be done to improve public access while at the same time.
Right, and I think safety is another issue here. I was really quite concerned when Carl identified that he's been receiving calls at 5, 6 o'clock at night for bathers that are stranded that can't get in. And, these are residents that left your beach and may be traveling at dark in tidal waters with some velocity and unsafe substrate that maybe aren't enjoying the benefit of, do not pass, enter at your own risk.
Right.
So I think that, I think that it's important that the mitigation on the safety and interest of other resource areas is what sells it. So when I say put a bulkhead down and that stops the advancement, it's a kind of a net neutral, but is the mission to stop the natural migration of a resource area that
Right.
provides habitat? No, that's not in the interest of the act. You have to have overwhelming proof of mitigation and public interest that swing the day.
Right. And I think it's safe to say that until you get through the process, you really don't understand the kind of mitigation that you're going to be required to expend dollars on.
I would not enter into a project here without some
Right.
type of mitigation and without addressing, the dune and/or some other resource area in another location. Like you could plant additional salt marsh against the boat, the ramp. I think in my simplistic view of this and limited history, I would pretty much guess that the salt marsh that was there has either been damaged by foot traffic in that area, or they did a better job removing substrate when they put the boat ramp in. So it's not an end-all. It's extending the longevity of a recreational facility in the context of rising sea level and climate change that we are all experiencing. So it is not a guarantee. It's actually an engineered retreat from the shoreline.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carrie, has our Conservation Commission had any discussion on any of these options at all?
No, they haven't had any, they haven't seen these so far, and I guess they're aware of the proposal, but haven't looked at the alternatives that have been presented yet. I would comment that my feeling is that 85% is probably optimistic on option 5. I'm thinking maybe 50-50 without the nourishment or dredging in that intertidal area would probably be a better indicative number for the percentage of getting the permitting through. That's at the local level, at least. I mean, there's always the appeals process, which might see it approved at the state level.
Okay. Yes.
One last question. The Great Salt Marsh. I've walked that thing from Bray Farm to Bass Hole probably 1,000 times in 30 years, and the banks of that creek are 5 or 6 feet high. And it used to be that you could never cross except for dead low tide, and now you could probably cross at half tide. So, my question is, looking into the future, and I know we don't have a crystal ball, but are we at any risk of jeopardizing the health of the salt marsh by letting the basin continue to fill in? Are we going to restrict flow and tidal flushing of the salt marsh and risk its health?
I think there are so many issues that contribute to what's going on in this very small area. Certainly what's going to continue to happen, because we see it at Sandy Neck, which is sort of the mirror image of Chapin Beach. As the sand supply gets cut off from updrift, but the beach continues to erode or move back. The end of the spit continues to elongate, but it curls back toward the land more and more. And you can see that happening at Chapin now. The only thing that really keeps this open is the flow from Chase Garden Creek. The same is happening on Clays Creek. As long as there's enough flow out, that'll stay open. But the amount of sediment that comes from both directions that winds up on that sand flat is the biggest contributor to what happens inside the sand flat with that salt marsh. And as that sand flow gets cut off and the bars continue to migrate, they'll probably get thinner and thinner as well. Water levels are going to rise. The salt marsh is going to have a tendency in this area where there's a great expanse of landmass that's relatively flat. The salt marsh has the potential to move back landward. And that's going to be a contributor to eliminating the bathing beach. So as the marsh moves back and fills in. But this is one of the most complicated systems that there is on the Cape. So predictions are risky.
Fair enough, thank you.
I think in terms of predictions being risky, I think on the surface, number 5 looks good. But in my mind, I know, even jetties, anytime you disturb the natural flow, there's always a reaction to that. And I don't know at what point in the process we'd be able to figure out what reaction that could have to other parts of the system. And I guess I understand building the wall, but you're not really building a wall because everything can flow through it. So what is the significance of it when everything flows through it? So if we're keeping back the growth, what causes the growth? Isn't it basically the seeds to come this way? If the water's flowing through, I'm not sure how that's gonna...
What happens is that if you think about plants in your garden, particularly herbaceous materials that are fairly shallow-rooted, and the marsh is essentially a lawn that grows in salt water. So the roots grow down, and then to some extent they also extend laterally. What we are proposing here is that at least on the 2 sides of that marsh that face the open cut now, we would put in garden edging, just the way you edge your perennial bed or
I have edging and I
lawn.
still have weeds on the inside. I guarantee it.
But the difference is that for your yard, you're putting a garden edging down maybe 8 inches. Here, that edging goes down 6 or 8 feet. So it goes down significantly below the marsh root line. And so what you're doing is the only thing you're doing is stopping the roots from growing in that direction. Now, these things are they need to have a little bit of a return, so they'll hook around the north edges a little bit, and the south edges just a little bit. But they'll continue to allow the marsh to grow north and south, just not east-west. The walls always get lined with filter fabric to keep the sediment retained, even though the water is allowed to go through with or without weep holes in the bulkhead material itself. The difference from the normal bulkhead that you see as a seawall is that these things are very low. They only go to the top of the marsh sediment. So the water can actually go over them with every tide cycle, as well as allowing water to drain out through the wall. But they keep the sediment and the root systems back.
And I guess what makes me nervous a little bit about the whole thing is that Dennis, on the other side, is making plans to address their issues at Chapin that could significantly impact the entire system over there. When you look at the water, first of all, I personally think signage is important because I've seen our lifeguards go out there and try to bring mothers with children back from the other side, and when that tide comes in, the current is very, very strong, and I think people should be warned. I hate risking our lifeguards. I don't want to see anybody's life risked, but I've seen it happen, and it's kind of scary to watch them go out there. So I think signage is important. When you say the water is rising, I know it's probably not, I mean, this is 2 feet above water level now. So if they dredged on the outside, how much would that impact the levels? I guess I'm just nervous about it really being a solution. 2 feet, if everything got dredged, well, right now, I foresee the whole thing filling in at the top. I'm not sure how much of this is even gonna.
He's not talking about dredging.
No.
He said.
I'm not talking about us, I'm talking about the potential for Dennis.
For Dennis.
If Dennis went
What's-
ahead and dredged, it would impact what we're doing on this side, I think.
At the moment, I think Dennis is looking at 2 alternatives. They've been told that extending the seawall along the beach and dune interface is not a likely option. And that's from the agencies, predominantly Coastal Zone Management and the Corps of Engineers. So they've retrained their focus on a groin system, which surprises me. But if they were to do that, then they're moving the erosion problem from one point to another. They might be able to fix the place where the beach is the narrowest, which is right around the curve as you go out to their bathing beach. But they would be required to do a significant amount of beach nourishment, and there's no place for them to get that sand. The other alternative that is still at least tangentially on the table is relocating the road so that instead of running along the north edge, it comes back through the marsh onto one of the dikes where the old road used to be. But their alternatives are getting fewer and fewer and fewer, and they're getting more and more frustrated with good reason.
What's a groin?
A short version of a jetty. Generally, a jetty is at the mouth of a creek or a river or an embayment.
So that would be
But
the corner
it's-
of Dr. Bortero Road, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Somewhere in that
Yeah.
neighborhood?
It's still a stone structure run generally perpendicular to the beach, to the shoreline,
Okay.
with the intent of catching sand.
So I guess trying to figure out what the board's pleasure is and where to go from here. Personally, I think it seems to me we've been narrowed down to 2 options, which is either 1 or 5. Perhaps we should have the Conservation Commission come up with what they feel might be best. I think one of the other things, obviously, is funding. Explore what potential fundings are for each option, because it may, if there are funding options.
Well, if Dave and Arlene need direction, I'm willing to make a motion that, according to what I'm hearing, the Board of Selectmen's preference would be to further investigate option number 5.
I'll second that.
When you say further investigate, what do you mean by that? Just
Well,
continue
I mean-
engineering, planning? What would your next step
I
be?
think the next step would be, you want to speak to it?
Yeah, I think, although we would love to get direction tonight, obviously, it sounds to me like you people need perhaps to talk with the Conservation Commission, and amongst yourselves, Mr. Forrest might like to go out now that the weather is nice and look at the beach. We'd be happy to do that with you.
If the board makes a motion to progress on option number 5, what are your next steps, is my question.
We would finish the survey and start engineering plans.
Is there money left in the RFP for that? Maybe we could tailor the motion to be contingent upon Conservation's agreement with our assessment, that number 5 seems to be the most logical, when at least the most likely path
And if not, then,
and have some more discussion.
okay, is it,
I'll second that.
you second that? Okay. Any further discussion on the motion?
I'll remove my previous second since no
Oh.
one's seconded.
He amended it, yeah.
All right.
Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, appreciate your time, your presentation.
Through the chair, would, to facilitate this, this meeting at the site and the conceptual plan for the geometry and the length of this, we have plans that we can mark up or, progress prints that we can at least show where this would be?
Yeah, I would say that you're going to work with Carl to carry out what the motion that we just made. So you can work with town staff, and
Okay.
he can give you your direction.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next item on the agenda is the school agreement discussion. So, I guess I'll just recap, Mark, wasn't at our, what's that?
This is the agreement that Selectman Holcomb had amended.
Oh, yeah, you
So
gave me
everybody
a
has
copy.
copies of it,
Yeah, okay,
So we work it
thanks.
in the same document.
Okay, so, at our previous meeting, we were discussing having a workshop amongst ourselves to talk about our options with the schools. Unfortunately, because of timing, we were unable to have that meeting. We had a joint meeting about the school building last night, and I brought up the point that at some point in time, we have to ask the school district to put this agreement before the voters. And Norm and Mike have worked very hard on this. We have actually, well, I guess I could let you speak to it, but I think to summarize it, and correct me if I'm wrong, you made great progress. The majority of the points that have been presented in this amended agreement were agreed upon within the subcommittee. The one point, to my knowledge, that was not agreed upon was the sharing of capital. So Norm has taken everything and all the work that they've done and put it into the document that's here before you today. And I guess what we're going to kind of do is let Norm go through the major points.
Yep.
And hopefully have a motion to send this to the school committee. The school committee can have their discussion and have to do with it what they want, but they have the authority to put it before the voters. So with that, I'll let you go through in detail. I'm not sure if you want to do it or Mike.
Sure, I'll be happy to do it, and Mike could jump in anytime. There's a lot of elimination of previous stuff in here, represented by the crossouts, and you could see a lot of old language that was no longer needed for the agreement. And certainly, Cleon and I had worked independently and then compared notes, and then this is pretty much a distillation of what we had agreed on. And as you pointed out, Tracy, we got to the point of the meeting with the full committee from Dennis, and there was disagreement in particular with regard to the capital section, but there were also some disagreements as a number of us watched the proceedings in Dennis. There were disagreements with other things as well, and some retracing of steps, but I'm not going to go through all that detail. I think if we can just go through this, and I'll focus on the major changes and the intention of those changes, so the board has an appreciation in full of what we were attempting to do. The first 3 pages are all a bunch of crossouts, really eliminating obsolete language. And one of the things we talked about is that this agreement is, or the old agreement, is an albatross, and you can see from these first 3 pages, I mean, 2/3 of the original language is being crossed out, so it truly is a very obsolete document. On page 4, at the top, it's the first paragraph deals with the determination of how many members each town would be able to have on the school committee, and this language changes the intention of those calculations, in that the previous calculations used the census counts. This document anticipates using the student counts based on a 5-year average. So the student counts as of October 1st and as a 5-year average. And that would, you know, if you run the numbers, it could potentially, as Dennis's student population shrinks, shrink Dennis's participation on the school committee from presently at 3 members to 2 members.
I have a question on that, Norm. How does that change the terms? How does it change the terms of an elected person? So if a shift happened in the midst of somebody's term?
Well, basically that's covered in here, and the person would finish out the term, and then there would be an election, and the subsequent election following that the replacement would be elected at that point. Excuse me, at that point.
It's just in a separate section?
Yes, and so where specifically?
That's okay, we'll get to it.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Second paragraph of page 4.
Yeah, I think that's, it says if a member is entitled to, and that's basically the same wording that existed previously, dealing with that potential eventuality. Jumping over to page 5, the only change there is the addition of a section, and this should be in red on everybody's. The only change there is the addition of a section allowing for the removal of a school committee member, basically following the same process in either town of whichever, as a select board member's removal would involve. And I think we all agreed, both Dennis and Yarmouth representatives agreed that that kind of provision was appropriate for the agreement. Going over to page 6, there's a couple of minor,
Well,
yes.
I have one on that because they voted recently, like within the last week, to remove the innovation part of Wixon, so we can take that out of the changed agreement.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I thought they voted to add it
Nope,
to
they
the new
voted
school.
to end it
To end
at
it?
Wixon, the school.
Interesting.
I read
Not
it
the
wrong.
school, but the teachers. Is that correct, Brian? Okay.
So the
So it's
the
no longer,
school
will no
committee did-
longer be staff.
He just voted not to do it.
So I'm not sure what the status of that, the word innovation school is. Well, it's no longer an
Well, that's what
innovation
it's
school.
called right
I
now.
know.
Yeah,
I know.
the question is that going to change the name or not?
Right.
If it does, then we just strike
would-
innovation.
right.
If it doesn't, we're leaving it.
Okay. Let's see, jumping down to, I guess it would be the bottom of the second paragraph, you see a section that says, leases shall be consistent in their provisions with this agreement. However, any inconsistencies will be resolved based on this agreement, the provisions of the lease agreements notwithstanding. And that's to resolve the issue that we had with the lease agreements having contradictory provisions to the
Regional agreement.
regional agreement. And here we're saying this agreement is what stands.
It appears that when they last modified the district agreement, that they did not go through the leases and amend them to be consistent with that the amendment of the district agreement.
Okay, you can see again on page 7, a lot of cross-outs. And this is pretty key section because it's talking about capital costs and how those would be apportioned. I don't think there's anything in 1A that's of great import. And then in section B, it talks about, it's just some additional wording with regard to middle school grades 4 to 7 existing before this agreement. Again, nothing too significant there. Section C at the bottom of page 7 is where it says such costs, meaning capital costs, incurred with any particular district middle school grades 4 through 7 constructed after signing of this agreement shall be apportioned 40% to the town of Dennis and 60% to the town of Yarmouth. This is where everything stopped in the last negotiations. Our position presented at the last negotiating meeting was that Dennis should accept 45% of the total cost, that was our initial negotiation point. And I think there's been numbers tossed around. I mentioned last evening that if we got to 40%, I thought that, speaking on my own, I would support that. I think it's an appropriate number in terms of what are the common facilities in the building. And I think that when you get through all that, about 40% of the building is common, or I'm sorry, it's more than that. But it would all fraction down to where probably Dennis should be responsible for about 40% of the total construction costs.
Two questions on that, if I may. Number one, why not 50%? I mean, they're not going to agree to this either, so why not just say 50?
We had approached that at one point, very honestly, and just gotten such an outlandish reaction that, we kind of faded back. And so this is, and this isn't written in stone. This is, for everybody's discussion here. So, if everybody felt strongly that it should be some number other than 40% for Dennis, then I certainly think that it could be changed.
So my second question, Norm, is the way the tech school building is set up is that each town's contribution to the building project fluctuates according to its enrollment. Does this give the flexibility in the case where if Dennis's enrollment should ever be more than Yarmouth's before the building's paid for? Does this give the flexibility for the proportion to change?
It does not, no. As it's currently written, it does not.
Okay.
If I could comment on Eric's questions. We think, Eric, that for Dennis's position, that they should pay based on the ratio of student population doesn't make sense. Because if they had their own building, they would have their own administration, et cetera, et cetera. But there are some things that are probably driven by population. They would probably need maybe a few less classrooms. They would probably need less teachers and things like that. So we figured there should be an adjustment. Our position was what we would like to see is 55-45. And I think that number is about where it was when the first regional agreement was formed with respect to the Dennis Yarmouth High School. But negotiations give and take, and so we backed off. But that, from my point of view, that would be our bottom line number. In other words, I wouldn't move a 1 percentage point off that number. That's it. It's that or nothing. In terms of the capital, it's a great point, and we talked about that. And I remember in one of the discussions, one of the Dennis representatives said, we will agree that the percentage doesn't change, but what they were basing that on was the student population ratio.
Right.
But our position would be that if we agree, whatever percentage we agree on, it stays the same throughout the life of the bond.
Or until it's renegotiated in a subsequent year. I mean,
If it's renegotiated.
It could be renegotiated.
Well, you know, again, so Dennis is unlikely to go for this. And if by some miracle we got it, and we then in 20 years found that the proportion of students had taken a drastic swing, so now it was 60% Dennis and 40% Yarmouth, they're sure as hell not going to change it then, because it works to their advantage. I'd like to see language that, you know, I suppose that works to our disadvantage if the if the population goes the other way.
I think one of
That's not what the trends indicate, though.
No.
Well, the trend indicates that our percentage is going to continue to go up. I was just wanted to build in a safeguard in the eventuality that went the other way.
If I may, when we started early on, one of the things that we were trying to stay away from was to try to put this in a historical perspective. And if you go back to page 7, historically was on equalized valuation. So we presented to the Dennis board, if you were to do that today, get off the studentship situation for a minute, just on what your value is in your real estate property, then it was, they were 55% bringing to the table, we were 45%, but even, what we presented to them was, even if you didn't want to do that, you wanted to add a variable to that mathematic equation, here's how some other districts did it, by adding in wealth indices too. So if you took, you know, our wealth indice, added to that, and then that would help modify some of that, just to get it off the whole student situation, but connect it to something that most all the other districts agreed to statewide is, and how singular districts do it is by equalized valuation. And they didn't want to hear that either.
Do you remember, Norm, what the percentage was when we took the equalized value and then added the income factor to that? I think Dennis was under 50%, but I don't think they were.
Not much.
Not much under.
Right.
Maybe like 48% or something like that.
Right.
So in other words, if you took the property values of both towns and you took the incomes of both towns and you averaged them, it would be fairly close to even.
Yep.
Dennis being a few points under 50%. If you did it on equalized property values, they would be somewhere around, I think it was 55% or so.
That's correct.
So we went through
And
all
other
these
districts
different-
use those methods.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think in terms of negotiating, I think you guys did a very good job of being flexible and showing that flexibility with the offering based on all the information that we're given. I personally think the people of Dennis will support this. The people that I have spoke to in Dennis understand the significance of our district. Their leaders may not, but when it comes to us being able to have a voice to them and them understanding what building their own school will cost them, I think they'll clearly see it's of value to them, not only educationally, but financially. I mean, we know what the cost would be for them to build it. I think that this is more than fair.
I think they will choose to upgrade Wixon.
Okay, well then, they can do that on their own.
Well, it won't make any difference at that point if they do
No.
that.
Right. I mean, they've so much as said that they don't ever foresee a point in the future where Wixon is not a school.
Okay, that's up to them.
You know,
But I
and
think,
for, you know, this school, we're looking at what, 69 and 38? Was that the split that they showed us last night for the,
It's about a 2/3, 1/3 split, yeah.
not the percentage, but 69 million and
Oh, the
38 million?
dollars, yeah.
That was about it?
Yeah.
69 would be.
28 million to them.
28?
I think so.
I think it was 38, because 108 total.
The math is it's almost a third, 2/3.
Yeah.
69 was the net after state reimbursement.
Yeah.
Right. You know, I got to think they're asking themselves the same question that I'm asking myself, is instead of building a $100 million school for 2 towns, can Yarmouth build a $70 million school, which is what we're going to invest anyway, just for Yarmouth kids? That's what I'm thinking, and you can bet they're thinking it too. For 40 million bucks, can they upgrade Wixon and put their 4 through 7 there? I bet they can.
Well, they, under the current agreement, if they chose to do that, they'd have to pay for a third of the cost of the Matikes upgrade.
Right.
And we'd have to pay,
2/3 of the cost of Wixon.
correct.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want their money.
Yeah. So, and we can, get to that point of constantly battling over, oh, no, we're not going to pay for that.
No, I
But ultimately,
understand.
that's what it comes down to. That's what's in writing. So, it is the 60/40 split is not written in stone. If everybody feels that it should be a different number, it's as easy as changing it. I would suggest that based on the work that we did within the committee, that I believe the select board in Dennis will support a 40% shift. I think they'll have a real hard time with a number that's a lot higher.
I think the finance committee will support a 0
That's what I heard.
increase over where they are under the current agreement.
Right.
Which is why we need to go to the voters, because they said very clearly in their meeting that they did not want to be inconsistent. They wanted to be on the same page with the finance committee, and the finance committee is willing to give 0 more. So in the spirit of negotiating and being fair and wanting to get this done, I would love to see 50-50, but I think as a step in the right direction, I would support the 40% to get, to move off the dime and be a fair partner.
Right. All right.
That's me. I'm one person.
Yeah, fine.
I don't. Mark, do you have any comments on that particular?
No, I'm just
Okay.
taking it all in, trying to absorb all of
Okay.
this. This was just dropped on me
Oh.
20 minutes ago.
The next section that has any significant modifications is the apportionment of operating costs. There's 2 changes in this section. One is that we had discussed a fairly significant list of administrative expenses that we felt should be shared 50-50 between Dennis and Yarmouth. And those were negotiated over time in terms of content. There's a detailed list, and the list totals up presently to $2,903,128. And that's what you see referred to on page 9. And we had reached a tentative agreement in the committee that that was an appropriate number, that it should be escalated in some way into the future. I had written into this at this stage that it should be escalated by 3% and redetermined at a 5-year anniversary date for more accuracy. It is principally involved in administrative staff. So superintendent, assistant superintendent, a variety of other staff members who are doing curriculum-related things as opposed to actually teaching kids. So all those individuals, plus their benefits, and then some supplies and a variety of other expenses related to administration are included in that $2,903,000. And it took a lot of work to get that list narrowed down. And I know Rich Bienvenu worked with Carol Woodbury on the list, and she contributed her expertise in terms of determining what costs would typically occur if if the towns had separate school systems, what costs would be duplicated in the two towns? So that's what this list represents.
And the 3%.
So the idea would be that 2,903,000 would be split 50-50 between the two towns, as opposed to using the student ratio percentage.
Just a couple comments on that. As Norm said, that list was basically put together by Carol Woodbury and Rich Bienvenu and was extensively debated. As I recall, at the last meeting that we talked about this, that list was going to be attached to the agreement as an exhibit, so that in the event of future negotiations, everybody would know which costs were included in that $2.9 million number. That was really phase one of where we wanted to go with this. There were other expenses that we said we would be bringing up at subsequent meetings. One that I recall was utilities, because we didn't think that, we thought that should be shared. But they shut it down after we came up with the $2.9 million figure. There seemed to be, at that time, basically an agreement on that number, but I understand subsequently they wanted to back off of that figure.
Right. There was disagreement about 500,000 of that number.
But what I wanted the board to understand is that 2.9 million did not include everything that we felt should be shared 50-50. That's, again, that was phase one, and Dennis did not have any appetite for further discussion after that. So that's not where we wanted to go, or where we thought was the fair point to be at, but it was a step forward based on where we are now.
And the other key point about that particular section is that it would be phased in over 3 years, not done all at once.
And I'll leave it to your imagination who wanted the phase in.
Again, we reached those compromises based upon the resistance that was offered and so forth. So,
Norm, the 3% that you built in adjusted annually,
Yes.
is that a historic number that you use?
it's the seat of the pants, frankly, based on what the typical salary increases is. Mostly salaries is in this, so we're kind of anticipating that the salary increases will be in that neighborhood.
Well,
it'll get out of whack. It'll get out of whack. No question.
Steps and lanes and all that.
What's that?
Well, what we've seen this year between the steps and lanes, it's 7%, so.
But this is administrative staff, principally, not teaching.
Okay.
Okay, so, let me just see where.
10 now, or? I think we
Transportation.
Chapter 10, page 10.
Oh, on page 9 still, there's about four lines down in the red notations. It says fiscal year on the basis of each town's Chapter 70 enrollment. That is a significant change, because the previous agreement talked about using the October 1st enrollment, and this is using the Chapter 70 enrollment. What the difference is that currently Dennis's percentage of Chapter 70 enrollment is about 33%. Their percentage of the October 1 enrollment is 31.8, I think. So there is a shift. And what does that represent? Well, I wanted to, and have maintained recently, that it's essentially forcing Yarmouth to pay for about 20 students from Dennis going to charter or other towns in the outside of the district, paying for their students to go. And that's what essentially we're being forced to do by choosing to use the October 1st enrollment as opposed to the Chapter 70 enrollment. So this corrects that, And it's a correction that Carol Woodbury is very much in favor of and agrees with.
I know I had asked you about one of my concerns about the chapters 70, and you didn't get to it in the negotiations, but I'm, in terms of the spikes, when we look at how it's apportioned.
Yeah.
A 3-year average, I think, would be helpful
It would be.
in planning.
Yeah.
I know we didn't get to it this time, but I
No.
do think for both communities,
I think some smoothing is appropriate for the future. I think that's a consideration, and very honestly, there are other things on the table for the future. Mike referred to the other fixed costs, and also revenue sharing was a big issue in the past, and Rich Bienvenu had done calculations that showed that revenue, if it was attributed to one town versus another, as opposed to being split by enrollment right now, Yarmouth would benefit significantly from that. So, I think that's an issue that needs to be explored in the future. But right now, it's not something that can probably be on the table. Next section, Section 5, it's just a technical change there with regard to being specific about how transportation costs are apportioned. And in this case, it uses the October 1 enrollment, because those are the kids that are actually on the bus. Amendments section, there's an addition of a sentence which allows the Board of Selectmen of each town to, by majority vote, to propose an amendment to the agreement. And as I think you're probably aware, this original agreement, you had to have a 10% of the registered voters of the town come forward with an agreement, or the agreement had to come out of the school committee. So, I think that has, we've seen that as problematic in terms of trying to get an agreement amended realistically. And, it draws some question as to, what our process is here with this amendment, but nonetheless, I think we should present this to the school committee, let them take action on it, and I think that's a good process.
And this doesn't really take away from that, it just adds another option to initiate the review process. It doesn't stop the school committee from doing it on their own. It just gives a better alternative, I think, to 10% of the voters doing it.
Okay.
it still has to follow the same process. It still has to go on the warrants of both towns. and-
That's right, that's right.
It's
Yeah,
just to
it still
get
has
it
to go
going.
through that process. I guess the last page, page 14, is where there's another section having to do with renegotiation. And the agreement really contained very little having to do with a renegotiation process. And so Section 15 adds that provision, and it says that the initial term of the agreement would be for 3 years, beginning on the date of its adoption, and would be renewable for terms of 3 years by acceptance of the members of each town, and that it's the intent of the agreement that renegotiation of its terms would be arranged for each successive term. So it would come up for review for renegotiation every 3 years. And then the last paragraph basically says that if there, there's a good faith provision in the second and last paragraph. And if the last paragraph says if we reach an impasse, then a mediator would be appointed to assist the towns in negotiation of an agreement, and that the towns would share the cost of a mediator. So that's about it. I don't know, Mike, you had any other thoughts or comments at this point? Dan?
I would just say that there was a lot that we left on the table
Yeah.
and saved for a future day. And I think it's fair to say that we brought all sorts of different proposals to the table. I think it's important for voters on both sides of the river to appreciate that. And what you see here, I think, is our best estimate as to where we found some agreeable middle ground before it all just froze up. And I think it's important that two things retrospectively. One is that we put in this term to come back to the table. And secondly, based on our experience this time, this provision for a mediator to occur is critical, because it was very difficult bringing all these options to the table. We tied up a lot of town resources and just got hit with no. And it was a challenge for this group. But this does represent, I think, what would our estimate be good faith negotiation on the Yarmouth side.
Has, I know this is fairly new, but I think one of the important things is that we ask town council to review the amendments. And
I'd like to see that exhibit too, that exhibit attached.
Yeah, it
because
should be, yeah.
I think it has real importance for future negotiations to be able to identify what
Dan,
expenses were included in the $2.9 million number.
Yeah, I think Dan has the list.
I think the big thing for the board here, in terms of the broader concepts, is what you want to do on capital. I think that's really where we need some input on two fronts. One is, what do you think is the proper allocation, percentage allocation? And secondly, how do you feel about that being subject to change or being fixed over the life of the bond of a new school?
I think one of the things that's important, and I think in any agreement that you have, it was not meant to be forever. And so I think the provision of re-looking at it every few years is really important. I think one of the problems with the benefit of that is the flexibility. The problem with that is bonding. So I think in this case, it's not the best case scenario for us, but I think in terms of getting an agreement done, it's probably our best.
I mean, if we go 40%, just take that as a hypothesis, that is not consistent with the student ratios. It's about 7 points above. So it's very hard to index that to a shifting student population. So my recommendation would be whatever we agree on, it stays as a fixed percentage through the life of the bond, because it doesn't match up from the point of beginning.
Well, the other point about that is that it, by not allowing a shift with student population, that you fix each town's responsibility for the bonding, and we know what we've got. We know what the number is. And right, wrong, or indifferent, that's the number.
So how did we do it with the high school? The high school bond, do we know that was fixed?
I think that stayed fixed.
It's fixed.
And so, but this doesn't even change that, because this says only new buildings. So that doesn't change any of the debt service that is.
Well, yeah, I would argue that if it's going to stay fixed, I'd like to see it at 50-50, because both towns are going to benefit equally from the bricks and mortar, regardless of how many children from each are in the building. And that way, both towns have equal skin in the game. Both are equal owners of the asset. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't ask for 50-50. It's going to be built on district land. Maybe if it were built on Yarmouth land, I might feel a little bit differently.
Well, it's essentially built on Yarmouth land. It's, we're giving up an awful lot of taxable revenue on that 60 acres of land, a portion of which is attributable to that new middle school. So, you know, there's.
The 60 acres, are you referring to the proposed building site?
Yes, I am, yeah.
You know, we may gain that back on the backside however we decide to dispose of the Matakey's property.
True, yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that led me to support the 40 is knowing that basically the Board of Selectmen supported the 40 already, and it gives us more probability of success.
You mean Dennis Board?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously I'd
Dan,
love 50, but I think.
What is your recollection on that?
My estimation was that they had moved to a point of 40, but it was not met well by their finance committee.
I think that's true. Yeah, that's my recollection as well.
And then after that, we had that mini seizure back in like January. We got over that a little bit, and then the big one came, so.
Yeah. So,
Mark, you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with you. I think to the extent to which there are provisions in this that are consistent with what the Dennis Board has supported or endorsed, I think that's the direction I would go in. I think the more we're consistent with them, I think the more likelihood that.
I still don't, but the caveat to that is, they still said they didn't want to be in disagreement with the finance committee, of which didn't support any change, so.
I think the clarity on this, you know, if it has to be that this is not a offer for compromise. This is a bottom line final, here it is, because.
Yeah, if we were starting the negotiations, I would have started at 50.
Right.
But here we are, we need to get this done.
We started at more than 50.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, well,
say that
right.
there was heartburn in the room would be an understatement.
Yeah.
When we talked about equity values, and we got looks of disbelief, and yet they are employed in other districts. Other districts do it that way. So the concept that they would be paying more than Yarmouth is not well received. Looking at it from their point of view, they got a good deal. Why should they move off the dime? That's where the finance committee's coming from. Our point of view is what Eric said. It's a benefit to both communities, and a word that we kept returning to constantly, and that Chapter 70 itself uses, is equity. What's equitable? What's fair? The agreement isn't fair. It's obsolete. It's more than needs to be revised, not just from the standpoint of the school. It's just an old, outdated agreement that isn't consistent with. In Chapter 70 formula, it needs by the state's own admission needs upgrading and changes, and it was based on some premises that didn't turn out to be totally accurate. So. All those things taken into consideration, we're just trying to get at some level of fairness between the two towns, and that equally benefits the students in both communities.
My suggestion, you know, what should be the process here? I think, Tracy, your recommendation regarding legal counsel review of it is appropriate. I think then what do we do?
I say we formally submit it to the school committee and ask them to put it before the voters.
Should we do that in person?
I'm not sure what the requirement is.
Well,
I think one of the things that's important is that we explain to them that we have negotiated.
Right.
And that this is our document.
Right.
And that hopefully they can vote to accept it, and that's the key, is their vote to accept it. That, in turn, places it on the warrants, I believe.
I suppose we'd probably want to address the school committee, present it to them, and make a presentation. Give them the agreement ahead of time, explain to them what we came up with and why, and ask them to put it before the voters.
Because I think without explanation, of the major provisions and the changes, it's kind of difficult just to bang absorb it. So, and I think it would be beneficial in public to have that discussion.
Can you look at the steps, though, the legal steps in terms of what the requirement are too? I just want to make sure. How long do you think that will take for town council to do this? Because maybe we should just go ahead and ask for a place on their agenda now for us to make that
I would say-
presentation. We need to move.
He's very backlogged right now with all the town meetings that
Yeah.
they're up against, so once we clear town meeting, you know, I would normally say like it would be back to us within a week's time frame. Might be a little bit longer
So
now.
in terms of timing, we'd have to call a special town meeting.
Yeah.
We could have a special town meeting with this and possibly the Mattakey's vote
Well,
together.
I don't think we would have to have a town meeting if it's initiated by the school committee.
Yeah, it still has to be passed.
Doesn't it go right to the
this-
ballot?
Yeah, there's a subpart N that they discussed at the meeting.
Oh, you're talking about
Mattakey's
you're talking
vote.
about the Mattakey
That's
school.
correct. The school
Yeah.
committee, if they vote that.
I'm talking about this document
Oh.
right now and getting this done before something like that happens.
The school committee is effectively recessed during July and August, aren't they?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Once a month during that time period? Okay.
I mean, there's, I think, under the subpart N, they have a certain number of days to meet to make that vote. If they're gonna go down that road, then you need a certain amount of days to give notice to the town for the vote. I don't know whether it falls within 60-day time frame. So, I mean, at some point in July, if they're angling for that, or August, they'd have to make the move on that.
Well, let's address this, and then I'd be happy to talk about that, because I have thoughts on that.
Yeah, really.
Well, for now, let's focus on what we want to do with this
All right.
agreement.
So I'll take this to town council, and then let's say that we can plan on a response back right after town meeting from town
Okay.
council.
I'm just hoping we can meet the timeline to get it to them in a time.
Yeah, once we
where-
get it through council, then it'd be just a matter of talking to the chair and getting it on the agenda for them.
Okay. You know, if we, maybe we should ask for a tentative date for the discussion, and then, if we had to postpone it or something, or ask for a special date,
yeah.
but ask for the next available date after May.
Yeah, it's all contingent to, it could be
Right.
contingent to his review as well, or perhaps he wants to be at that meeting when we make the presentation to answer any questions. I mean,
Yeah.
however it is, and if, I'm not sure what the process is, I think that's one of the things that we really need to look at. Anybody else have anything on the amendment?
No, I think Norm and Dan's comments are right on point, and
Do we need a motion to accept this?
At this point, I would leave it like this,
Okay.
because it's draft form.
Okay.
So wait till I get it finalized.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we have the opportunity to vote in public session prior to
Yep.
bringing it before the.
Understood.
Okay, so, school agreement discussions in general. Eric?
So I'd like to lead this off. Last night, Peter McDowell asked a very good question. After the owner's project manager explained the two town meeting options, either the school committee initiating the vote under that, what is it? Chapter N, Part N, or the boards of selectmen in each town can take control of the town meeting process. And I'd like to make a motion, and the answer to the question, or the question was, who gets to decide? And the answer was, whoever gets there first. So I'm going to make a motion that this board vote to take control of the town meeting vote as it relates to the school vote and the funding, rather than allowing the school committee to move forward with it under Part N.
I'll second that.
Okay, any discussion on that motion? I guess I have a question. So, I understand what you're trying to do. You're basically saying you want the people of the town to have a vote. I guess your motion, though, was you want to take control of it, but basically you're saying that, what does that motion mean?
What happens with Part N is what happened with the tech school.
Yes.
It goes to a
directly
vote,
to a
it goes
ballot.
to a vote without a funding mechanism. and it goes straight to the ballot.
Correct.
If we do that, all of this work over capital costs is for nothing, because it will get voted on, number one, as the project, and then number two, this board will then have to decide how to pay for it. And we're going to have to decide how to pay for it, whether any of this happens or not. And I think Mike said it straight out last night. You know, we may not be in favor, or we may not decide to go down this road unless Dennis decides to pick up a bigger piece of the tab than they are currently required to. And I feel that way too. And I think that it's our job to get the best deal for the taxpayers of the town of Yarmouth. And the best deal is to not build this school under this current agreement. You know, I think we can all agree that Yarmouth needs a new school. What Yarmouth doesn't need is Dennis. Dennis needs us. So I want the power of the vote to be in our hands, because I think what happened, you know, I'm on the tech committee, and I think it's a great project. But what I personally think, you know, 75%, that's crazy. Nothing ever gets 75% of the vote. But if I were a gambler, I would bet that people thought it was paid for when they voted for it.
Which is why I was talking about putting the funding first, like Barnstable did.
Right.
But anyway.
Yeah. Well, the other, I guess it's just occurred to me, the other key component that's not covered in the agreement that we still need to talk about is the $750,000 we paid, and how we get Dennis to reimburse us for that, for a portion of it.
Well,
And I'm not sure if that should be in this agreement or if it should be part of, you know, what we talk about in this regard.
okay, so
I just want it to
I
be-
just want to make sure, but you're saying, so you're asking that it does not take the Chapter N?
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
Is there,
In other words, that our board would decide on the timing and content of our public meeting, our
Correct.
town meeting, and
The warrant.
our vote.
so it would go to town meeting, then to a ballot, in a
Right.
warrant that we would put before the
That
voters?
would be the process.
Okay.
That's
Correct.
correct.
Is there anybody else have any comments or questions on that motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. So do you want to talk about the feasibility funding? Because
Yeah, and you know, I'm sorry, I just, you know, kind of dropped that at this point. You know, as a board, we dealt with that with the school committee, and the Dennis Select Board has voted, according to what Cleon said last night, that they would reimburse our town for their portion based upon student enrollment,
if the project was
if
approved.
the project moved forward. You know, I get a knot in my stomach every time I hear that wording. But we need to have some assurance, either in the agreement, add it to the wording of the agreement, which I neglected to do, or have, I don't know how the
MOA.
school committee would deal with it.
Well, we could always have a memorandum of understanding as well, but
A memorandum of understanding?
I think
that,
it's probably better to put it in the, well, no, because, I mean, that's hard to put in the agreement, because basically that's only if it's really two separate
Right.
items, and so if we approve the agreement and both towns approve the agreement, then we can't get the school funded, then it still doesn't.
You could add it into the phase-in, the 3-year phase-in. You could add their share into one of those payments.
So what happens if the school building was never approved, though? And yet we get that
Well,
passed?
like Norm, I have a real problem with kind of the opt-in, opt-out position that they have.
Yeah.
You know, we'll go along for the ride, and we'll pay you if we like where we end up.
Right.
I think we could If you figure out that percentage, we could add it maybe into the third year.
Well, it's a dollar amount. We could add that to the wording of the dollar amount, just say,
And to give them time, you could always put it in like to the second and third year.
yeah, it's like $250,000, right?
Be like
Somewhere.
33% of 750,000.
But wait a minute, we're getting reimbursed from the MSBA. Yeah,
Yeah,
so it's
right,
not
it's
the
a-
full
no,
amount.
no, I
It's
know,
only a
I know.
percentage of what's left over.
Yeah.
So it's not that I mean, it's,
It'd be easier to wait to see what the final end
yeah.
reimbursement comes in. at,
Yeah,
what the
and it
dollars
may
are.
want to be separate from, we maybe have to do it in, should it be, I don't think it should be in the regional agreement, because,
It's a very temporary type situation. I think
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
could work on drafting a letter from our board to their board, delineating some of those terms, take a vote on it, send it over,
Yeah.
see what happens.
you mean later on,
Yeah,
when we
well,
see where the.
once we get, we'll have to run a projection on the budget, what the estimated dollar value is to get to the next level, find out what's there.
I mean, they have to have a number that they can bring to their town
Yeah,
meeting.
a final number, that's
Right.
correct. That's
And I guess if we were going for a November vote on the Station Avenue project, that would be the appropriate time to ask them to put that in their town meeting as
Mhm.
well.
Right,
Right.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Whenever we put the project before the
Right.
voters, probably would be a good time.
Norm, I've got a question. Obviously, this preceded me, but what I'm curious about is if the town meeting vote was to authorize the use for only a feasibility study for Mattakey, then how does a government body
That's a great
get the
question.
authority to expand the scope without some kind of town meeting recognition? That, to me, there's a real question of just spending it beyond, using funds that are outside the scope of what town meeting authorized. I raised that because I've worked in towns before where if I were in the town manager's office and I did that, I would have been tarred and feathered and kicked out of town. So I'm just,
Mark,
did we go to town meeting? Did someone go to town meeting to get a vote to expand the scope of that?
We did not. I call it weasel wording. There's weasel wording in the original authorization at our town meeting that says there's about 15 words that basically say, or as the school committee sees appropriate.
So that was
something to that effect.
So that was worded into the
Yes.
article when it was moved?
MSBA has said that that is sufficient.
Yeah, if I may, I did go to council with this, and then I followed it up with MSBA. That was standard language that's used in this situation, provided by MSBA. Everybody that I spoke to, including Jay Tellerman, said that they believe that that language is specifically chosen to provide the flexibility that Selectman Holcomb was just talking.
And either,
But when we
Unbeknownst to us.
yeah.
No, but that's the point I'm getting at, is, I mean, we all went in thinking the funds were going to be used for a certain
So
purpose.
if you went back
Was-
even further and watched our motions in relation to that money, we were very nervous about something like this happening. And we were very clear in our vote and motion to create a feasibility committee, not a building committee, for just this reason, because we wanted it to stop
Yeah,
and us to be able to do an analysis before the train just went. And guess what happened?
the train took off.
The train's gone.
That's
We're
amazing.
still-
So,
The consultants, however, still say we're in feasibility. And that's it.
Yeah,
You know,
it's a
yeah,
semantical
that's it.
situation,
But
so
it
once
is-
the statement of interest gets submitted and then you get accepted into the
Yeah.
program, then the clock is ticking, you've got to assemble, the building committee gets assembled,
the feasibility committee.
well, it's
Yeah.
what the state calls it, so once you agree to go into that route, then they're driving the bus if you want
Right.
their money,
Right,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, any other discussion on the school issue? All right. So moving on to town meeting article assignments. The draft is in front of us. We have all 5 of us here, so that's just great.
You can roll the dice and
All right, so Articles 1, supplemental appropriations, operating budget, enterprise budget, water, typically the budgetary items go together, and I know Eric has always had the But I'll volunteer to do those if you'd like.
What numbers are they? 1 through what?
Well, most of them, so 1 through 5 would be basically moved and explained by the board. Article 6 would only be moved by us and explained by the school committees. Same thing with Article 7. Be moved by
So you're
us and
gonna go
moved.
through, you're gonna do 6
Well, I
and 7
mean, I'll
as well?
just, I can do whatever you want.
Well, the big one,
Just start trying to start the process here.
the supplemental appropriations are not, that's
Easy.
not a biggie. I
No.
mean, that's the
Oh, there's 2
snow.
items.
Right, it's snow, and I'm not sure what else, it's,
Snow and the golf.
yeah, okay, so,
Well, there's, what, 36? There's 5 of us,
yeah.
7
There's
each.
40,
7
oh,
each.
yeah.
And Norman can have the odd one?
Okay.
I mean, Tracy gets number 2, right? That's the operating budget, that's where the big discussion is of the,
Okay.
So, is Tracy got 1 through 5?
Let's give her 1 through
I'll
7.
just take 1 through 7.
Yeah.
oh, all right.
Through
So you're
7.
gonna do everything up through 7?
Yep, and then I'll take my shoes off and
And
I'll
watch the fun.
You can kick back and the
take-
rest of
Yeah.
us will go?
I'll take 8 through 14.
Oh, you're gonna do it that way, all right,
I mean, I want to make this painless.
okay. 8 through 14, okay, oh, no, wait a minute, I'm gonna volunteer quickly
I mean,
here.
unless somebody has
I'll-
a pet article that they want to,
I'd like to do
So-
the marijuana ones.
Well, I'll
those
do-
are all yours.
I'll do 15 through 21 then, or 15 through 22, whatever it takes.
This is gonna be so nice.
That's Norm.
Norm,
15 through 21.
Norm.
Well,
Why don't you take
Wait a
through
minute.
23?
Wait a
That
minute,
gets you
15
through all of the
Wait a minute,
CPA
15's
articles.
withdrawn.
15's withdrawn,
So we
Oh, so
need
do 16 through 23.
16 through 23, all right.
And those are easy, because most of them you just move, and CPA is going to,
That's fine.
Yeah, there's still,
Yeah.
24 is the land that was withdrawn, okay.
so you're doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Norm. So,
There's 3,
So,
there's
Mike-
2 for the planning board, so I would do 25, 6, and 7. Right?
Mike, well, some of them are if one, not the
Yeah.
other,
There's a
so.
flow chart here.
No, but those 3 are gonna go, I think.
No, it's, with the flow chart, if 26 is the general bylaw to ban, if that passes and the ban goes through, then with 27 gets withdrawn, and then Article
Right.
28 gets moved, withdraw Article 29.
What number is that?
So why don't you do through 31, and then Mark can do
Mark will
33.
Wrap up.
How about that? Is that okay?
Sounds good.
All right, good.
So,
Well, the planning board's gonna do
Yeah,
30
you
and
just have to
31.
move them. You have to move them.
Yeah, that's just, right.
So you're gonna move and explain
Through 31.
25, all the way through 31, which is all the zoning, and then from there, Mark can finish.
Right.
Mike and Mike. Mike does 31, and then
too
Mark
easy.
starts at 33.
Right.
Who's got 30, oh, 32's withdrawn, okay.
Yep, and then, so Mark's gonna do 33, 34, 38, 39. Is that okay, Mark?
39, it's Quirk and David Reed have those, has 39, according to the sheet.
They're explaining.
Oh, they're explaining, okay.
Yeah, but we usually
All
move
right, I
them.
get it,
We move them all.
I get it.
Yep. Okay. That was easy.
And
I
who
like
moved-
it.
Who moved, the petitioners moved their own articles on the last 3?
No, we move them.
We do,
They have
Yeah.
to explain them.
okay. Who, Mark has those too?
He just has to say, not in
Mark's at
favor,
42.
not in favor,
Right.
not in favor.
Got it.
That flow chart
I'll
will
have
be
to-
helpful,
Yeah,
I
I'll
think.
memorize the flow chart.
I also need to talk to you about, because you recommended as a board the ban.
Right.
Here's some language for your narrative as to what the recommendation of the board was, why it was such. I mean, it could be as simple as,
We didn't really have a discussion on that.
well, I mean, it could go as simple as the town election that was held,
Yeah,
what,
right.
2 years ago? The town banned it, right?
Sure.
So
The town
it was an
voted.
I think that should be part of the
Yeah.
explanation.
Town voted
Write
not to
something
support
up
it.
and just take a look at it and get back to me.
Sure.
Perfect. All right, does anybody have any questions on town meeting article assignments? At all? Okay, perfect. So we will have a pre-meeting posted of town meeting.
What time is that?
Well, town meeting will,
9,
so usually it's 8.
8.
We'll have to take some final votes. Unless anybody's prepared. Well, it says
What
assignments.
do we have? Oh, the budget.
We have some other, we have, all the ones in red, I think. Vote from the floor. Recreation Sandy Pond.
I think one of the.
Oh, that's
Big
FinCom.
one is the acquisition of Route 28, 275.
Oh, no, so we have,
Wait for that.
so we have the school budget,
Yeah, the school budget, because,
which is not,
we were able to
Right,
get the
left.
dollar value onto the ballot.
Yep.
So I think we addressed that.
We have the-
Because they had amended their budget, we took a vote on it.
Capital Stabilization Fund.
Oh, collective bargaining agreements is one that
Yep.
we're gonna need to have a discussion on that one.
Open Space will be given some information the day of. I don't know why the other ones are from the floor. For the marijuana. I think we didn't want to print them in the warrant that we were in favor of them. You know, obviously, I think we voted strongly to support not, we voted to ban recreational sales. However, I think, you know, we know the importance of having the zoning in place should that fail. So,
That's correct.
I mean, we just didn't want to confuse voters by saying we recommended it in the, but that'll be quick.
Yeah, the flow chart will be part of the description for the voters to understand, because it does get complicated.
Is there anybody prepared to do anything, or will we still want to just leave it for the floor, for the morning of?
Yeah, on marijuana specifically?
Well, just any of them, just to get them off the table, they're still, but we can just leave them, that's fine. We can
Yeah,
vote
8
the morning
o'clock,
of,
yeah. I
just
mean, the
making
big
sure
one
we
is,
have enough time.
The Route 28 parcel, but that's
Well,
still.
we need information still on that,
Yeah,
right?
Right,
Okay,
it hasn't come back to us yet.
all right. Board and committee actions, Mark.
We have in your packet a resignation from Bob Isidore, who I think the board appointed to serve as the Yarmouth representative to the Barnstable County Human Rights Commission. And I would accept the motion to accept his resignation as well as appreciation for his service, effective May 2018.
I'll make that motion.
Wait a minute, though. We can't do effective votes. We've learned that the hard way. As soon as, if we take this vote now, it's effective immediately.
Oh, it is?
So we can't do it. Yeah, let's hold that then, if you don't mind, and
So I
I'm not sure
withdraw.
if there's a vote this week or in the next week he wants to take, but if we vote to
Effective
accept
May
his
1, yeah.
resignation, it,
Understand. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for that clarification. That's it.
okay. Approval of minutes. Minutes are in the packet of November 28th and December 12th.
We approved them as filed?
Is there a second?
A second.
Any discussion on the minutes, the motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes both pass. Upcoming agenda review. As we talked a little bit to Dan before this meeting, it's been history that we usually meet the week before town meeting, but not the week after town meeting. It's up to the board if you'd rather meet on the 1st than the 8th and take the week after off. That's how we've done it historically. I'm not
So
sure.
then reorganization would wait until the 5th of June?
No, I'm talking about the May 8th meeting. So annual town meeting is on the 5th. which is a Saturday, then we're gonna meet Tuesday. Typically, we don't meet that Tuesday. So I'm wondering if we can switch those things on the item, on the warrant, I'm sorry,
Agenda.
on the agenda to May 1st. So we'd meet Tuesday, then Saturday, and then have that week off.
Have 2 weeks.
2 weeks off, yeah, then it would be the election. So the only thing is that wouldn't leave any time for anybody to have comments after town meeting prior to an election, but I just know typically we've taken the week after off.
We always have.
What is the board's desire? Can this drive-in site move to the 1st?
No, I would say that that probably wouldn't happen. They are having a meeting tomorrow. They're trying to finalize some stuff planned for the 8th. I mean, the best thing that could happen to them is it gets pushed out a little bit.
To the 22nd?
Yeah, that would be even better. Because as it is now, we have had radio silence with Barnstable on those 2 items that are on the list, so those very much likely would fall off. So the drive-in site would work out nice right there, as it turns out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the board okay with that? So we will not meet on the 8th, we'll meet on the 1st,
Okay.
and then we'll move the drive-in site to the 22nd. The 22nd will also be our reorganization meeting, so we'll have to add that. Yes, May 22nd. Okay, and I see no reason, yes, 6 PM is fine. I see no reason to meet before that on the 1st. Or again, until, hopefully,
There might not be any items.
next year,
Right.
at least.
So that would be at, just to be clear, at 6 PM on the 1st?
Correct, 6 PM on the 1st.
I'll have to take a look to see what's in front of us for materials for a meeting. There might not be.
Well, let's see, maybe some of these other items.
These are all.
How about that Barnstable water matter? Would that be ready for the first?
We were supposed to meet with Barnstable last week, and of course that got postponed, so we had to reschedule, so it's more a matter of timing with them. So I don't want to necessarily commit it. There's a chance it could make it on the 22nd.
What happened to the dog park light lady?
There was kind of a little bit of a change in that situation. Carl could give you more of an update, but it's actually all good, so it wasn't a bad situation at all.
Okay. All right, because I know she was on for May.
Yep.
All right. Well, we won't have the wording back from town council to rehome that by then either. And we can't reopen the warrant before the other town meeting, so we can't move that up. So by charter, we need to meet, our annual meeting is a meeting. I don't know if that counts as a meeting, though.
What's a regularly posted?
And then the 20,
So the 15th,
So-
22nd will be our
and the
meeting.
15th isn't a meeting, though. So we would just be meeting then on the 22nd. Would that meet the charter requirements?
I think we're fine with the 5th being a regular scheduled meeting.
Okay. All right, so take that out of your calendar, Norm.
Which one?
The 1st. I know you just added it, but we don't
Oh,
have,
for
we don't have
crying out loud.
anything. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll be only meeting May 5th
Pressing your
and May
technological
22nd.
abilities.
Oh, my God.
8th is off and the 1st is off too?
Correct. Okay? Unless something comes up.
Yeah, I don't foresee anything, but unless it's an emergency that we couldn't address on the 5th.
You think we'd be ready for a community forum by the 1st of May? Probably not.
Nah, I gotta wait till all the parties to the party get back into town.
Okay.
and we have
All
a
right.
chance to do a debrief.
Okay. Perfect. Anybody else have anything on the upcoming agenda? Okay, individual items. Mark, we'll start with you.
I don't have any to present.
Mike.
I'll pass for now.
Norm. He's looking for his notebook. It's
No,
never good.
No, I don't. I don't have anything else. Thank you.
Okay, Eric.
I have two things. Just, I guess, what is the last reminder that I'll be able to make, that on May 2nd at 8:30 at the St. Pius Church Life Center will be the annual Committee Volunteer Appreciation Day. We're going to have bacon and sausage and eggs and toast and muffins and fruit provided by Piccadilly Deli, I believe. So we thank them for catering this as they did last year. So that is that. And the last thing I wanted to say was more of an announcement. Given the events of the last 2 weeks, it was very difficult for everybody in this town. And when I started seeing the blue ribbons go up on the street signs and the mailboxes and the fence posts and the telephone poles, I made the very difficult decision that I'm not going to put campaign signs up. When I drive down the road, I see the blue ribbons and I feel the anger and the sadness. But I also feel very proud to be a member of a community that came together the way it did at the events that took place last week. And this decision has weighed very heavily on my mind, but I've decided that, in my mind, it's the proper thing to do. And I've also decided that if I'm not successful on Election Day, it won't be for lack of signs. So I'm making this statement tonight, and I'm also going to make it tomorrow night at Candidates Night, because I don't want people of this town to think that I'm not willing to put in the effort and that I don't care. I've made this decision because I care very much. And I'm not asking that anybody else follow suit or feel the same way I do. This is just the way I feel in my heart. So I'm not going to do it. You know, I will stand out at the landfill and on the weekends for sure, but I just don't want to put the signs out. I would rather, you know, Election Day will be less than a month from Sergeant Gannon's funeral. And I personally don't feel right about it. So you won't see my signs, but I ask that you still vote for me on May 15th. Thank you.
I have a comment on that. I wasn't going to vote for you, Eric, but I think now I will.
I appreciate that, Mike. I hope about 1,500 other people feel the same way.
I'm sorry, I made some comments at opening statement. I'm sorry that we had a mix-up with the schedule timing that you missed, but we did pay tribute.
I'm sure of that.
I guess I could, and I'm sorry, I don't know if you guys want to add your own.
No, I had the wrong entry on the time on the meeting, and I apologize for being late. And I knew that there would be tribute paid to Sean at the very beginning, and I'm very sad that I missed that. As Eric said, I think I reiterate his sentiments that as difficult as this was for everybody since the tragedy occurred, I'm very proud of the way the community responded to it. The police, our fire guys, our town staff, our town administrator, our board of selectmen, but most of all, the ordinary citizens, the people of the community, and I don't just mean the Yarmouth community, I mean the Cape Cod community, that were out in the streets when Sean was taken from the medical examiner's office to the funeral home, and when he was taken from the funeral home to the church, and then from the church to the cemetery. People were there every step of the way. And you had one violent act that caused tremendous sorrow and loss. But when you weigh that against the response, you had a sea of good things, of good people. And I think when we look back on this, we'll never be the same as a community, just like this country never was the same after 9/11. Things have changed forever. But I think the thing that we'll all remember from this is the real power of the people of the greater Cape Cod community toward compassion and caring and support. Like Eric, I'm very proud to be a member of that community.
Thank you, Mike. Mark?
No, I just, sorry I missed the beginning, but I would want to associate myself with the words so eloquently expressed by Mike, and I'm sure the thoughts of the board earlier in today's meeting. It has been a very difficult 2 weeks, and the fact that we came together as a community, and the fact that the Cape has sort of been united in many respects, I think is that's been an overwhelming experience as well. So again, I just want to associate myself with the comments made by the board earlier today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Did you have Dan? And I know I thanked you at the beginning, but honestly, we had some key people, Pat Armstrong being one of them, and you. And I know it's hard to pay. Not trying to make light of it by the thanks, but from the outside, it was seamless. What people saw was overwhelming and powerful, but behind that was a coordination effort of really an army of people, a small army, but it wasn't easy. And your leadership through that, something, I think Mike said it well. I don't think we'll ever be the same as a community. I think my decisions sitting here will never, I'll look at things very differently. That's probably not the right thing to say, because it's not like I took people's lives for granted before. We didn't. We've always been very conscientious about thinking of it, but never did we think that would happen to one of our own people. So it brings a whole new light, and really to even sit here today and do the business of the town, everything else in terms of people's lives is so insignificant. So it's hard to get back to the business, because really people are what's important, and I just want to thank you.
I appreciate that, and I can tell you through circumstance, having to have that horrible phone call from Chief Frederickson on Thursday, I had an inside seat on everything that unfolded, and then from the communication that I sent out to the board. But particularly, from my perspective, there are some folks that stood hugely tall, starting with Chief Frederickson. From that time in the hospital to how he was really the father figure of the police department. I mean, just the incredible broken spirit of all the men and women that were there that night was just horrific. To getting in front of the microphones to a national audience, saying a very passionate, very reassuring message, to sitting with the district attorney to help start crafting the arraignment document that had to be generated for the next day, because that had to get done because number 125 was in custody, to Steve Exaros, to Kevin Lennon, who was just unbelievable, Andrew O'Malley, Mike Bryant, and the entire YPD family, the wives of YPD. I had seen this once before in Westfield, and I know that the police are just incredible as it relates to taking care of their own, but it was an unbelievable effort. To the logistics from that night, sitting there where everybody's like had never been through this before, but having gone through this, I knew the state police, the Massachusetts State Police, would arrive and they take care of this. To all of the staff from the Massachusetts State Police that assisted us, Sergeant Byron Rizos, he's the state police person that does this for communities. It's a very difficult thing. I was familiar with him before. To Jim Plath, who was with us, particularly to the chiefs of Plymouth and Sandwich, who were there from the beginning to support Frank, and then the other chiefs that came to render support. To Selectman Stone's point, the Cape Cod community, unbelievable. To the Dennis patrolmen who staffed our station, to the Dennis dispatchers, to all the other police community folks that supported that, to Deputy Chief Sawyer, the entire fire department who started working that night, and to the citizens that showed up to the police station that night with the food. It was like, what can we do to help? And it was this enormous army that was just ready to be pointed. And then to come around to the vigil that went off, and very powerful night. And then the events of Tuesday and Wednesday were just unbelievable. And it was sometimes hard to know what was going on outside the world because we were all inside the world. And I can only look back now on streaming video of what went on. But by all measures, you all saw the patches from all over the country and from Canada, and we are changed forever, no question.
In Dallas, Texas.
Dallas, Texas, yep. So, tremendous. But certainly there is a huge anger. I picked it up that night. We've got to deal with it as a community, as a Cape Cod community, and that starts with us figuring what that looks like in the future. So we'll start working on that as soon as, like I said, all the folks that are integral to that effort get back into town. We'll start making sure that, this is something that we can hopefully harness to change for the betterment, because it should never happen, ever, in a community, never. A mom should never go through this, a family should never go through this, a community should never go through this. And I'm angry, I'm really angry over what happened. To Selectman Talley's point about, I know a lot of the cops and the firemen, and this should never, never happen. And we've got to figure out why it did and what we can do to change it.
But to your point, and I don't want to take too much time, many of us were there the evening with you. If people could have seen Frank, and Chief, I'm sorry, but if they could have seen his composure and his thoughtfulness of every person, he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about every person in his department and making sure all the boxes were checked. And it was nothing short of amazing. Watching him at that vigil, and then really being a leader in our community and helping the people heal with his words. I don't even have the words to explain how I feel about what he's done and the power of him and his true grit. We've seen it. It's amazing.
Chief Carnes, I would mention too.
Yes.
Played a huge role.
Yeah, when I was just going to mention him. The night of the shooting, when we were down at the police station, Chief Carnes was there, and he was great support to Frank Frederickson. And in addition to the people Dan mentioned, the chief of, I think it was Auburn, was there that evening too, where they lost a police officer in a shooting. I mean, so the response was immediate. All these police chiefs converged on the Yarmouth police station to be there to give aid and assistance to Frank and to support him, because they knew what he was about to have to go through. And he was very, very grateful for that support. And that went a long way, really, with him being able to do what he did. So it was amazing, the people that came there that night to be there for him, knowing what was waiting for him. And there was all kinds of press there that had to be addressed, and the district attorney's office had not arrived yet. They were on their way, and then they subsequently came, and Mike O'Keefe and Brian Glennie were there. And Chief, every time I've talked to him since, he just was so grateful for those people, and Dan was there, and it went a long way to give him the strength, really, to get through the next several days. So, I'm thankful to all those people who were there for our chief.
He had a group huddle at the hospital, and from that moment, the light went on, and he just took care of business, and it was unbelievable. I'll also be remiss if I wouldn't say that that night from across the country, I continued to field emails and phone calls from national reporters wondering about Nero the dog and if he was going to make it. And it was unbelievable to me. Here we are in the midst of this tragedy, and the entire country wanted to know if the dog was going to survive. And you know, that's a good story. And all the folks that took care of the dog, great credit to them for their dedication. And all things look like now he's going to survive and have a good rest of his life. So
He's tough like the rest of the YPD.
So with that being said, if you don't mind, I would move to a consent agenda item, and at the top of the item is a last-minute request for a special liquor license. And I know Selectman Stone knows the details behind this, so if you'd want to explain
We
that.
have, and I see the ladies out there, we have an application from Katie Clancy, who's going to, I guess, be the licensee to do a fundraiser, K-9 Relief Fund, at the Howell-a-Day and Kennel and Training Facility at 12 Industrial Park in West Yarmouth. Now, that's going to be, the name of the event is going to be Heroes for Nero. Need I say more? It's going to be on May 10th, 6 to 9 p.m. There will be recorded music and an amplification system. Beer and wine will be served. It's a fundraiser, obviously. Statutorily, I mean, what our policy normally is to advertise and send out certified mail notice. But we don't have to do that legally. So then we were looking at publishing. We had a timeline where we were going to publish and have our licensing clerk send out regular first-class mail notices for May 1st, trying to really rush to meet that deadline. And it became apparent that we may not and probably would not be meeting on May 1st. So we want to put this matter forward on the consent agenda. Behind this 100%. And I ask the board to approve this and also to waive the fees.
I'll move the consent agenda, including that.
Second.
Okay, you have a motion to approve the consent agenda, including this application. So you're moving the entire consent agenda, correct?
Yes.
With the second. All right, all those in favor? Aye. Aye, anyone opposed? Okay, you're all set. Sure, come up. Either there, Katie, or the front, whichever you're more comfortable at.
I feel like I can hide more back here.
Okay.
My name's Katie Clancy, and I initiated this event, and I cannot say enough about everybody that we've come across for the town to make this happen. Our first person I talked to was Linda Hill, and she was just wonderful. She said, listen, we got to follow the rules, but we're going to help you. And that's all we wanted was follow the rules. And the town administrator, and both of you have been, all of you, it's just the whole, everything that you said about the community coming together has been absolutely wonderful. We cannot thank you enough. And I got to tell you, as soon as we announced that we were doing this started as this little tiny event that had nothing to do with Nero or anything. But after that event, I woke up the next morning and said it had to be that. Made a little announcement on Facebook. It went from like 30 people maybe coming. We have about 3,000 people who want to come to this event. We are, if Mark Grills, if you're watching, we're keeping the numbers low. We are obviously going to keep it much smaller, but we have like 10 people for every spot that we have because everybody wants to come and help. And I want you to know that this is not just a fundraiser. It's going to be a healing event. The K-9 Relief Fund is bringing some of their retired dogs, so we see where that money goes, and that money's going to be there available for Nero and whoever's caring for him when he retires. And we're so pleased to be able to do that, and we simply could not have done it without you. So I really want to thank you for taking a chance on us. We'll make you proud. Thank you.
Thank you for paying it forward.
Thank you very much.
There was a $10,000 anonymous donation, which is of a magnitude for the fire department for the purchase of smoke detectors for those folks in need. That's tremendous. So thank you to the anonymous donor for that as well.
Thanks very much.
On a town update note, I can tell you we're down a couple of selections for both the Creekside Energy Park. We're going to make a final recommendation soon to go to the board with a vendor. And then also, we started the interview process of 2 vendors for the Center Street and Route 6A project. I had an interview today. We should be executing a contract shortly on that to get that process started. I think, based on what I've seen today, it definitely hits the desire line in that area. So those things, much like what you saw tonight with Bennett Environmental, were projects that were desires that we're now at the point where it's close to go time. So I'm very pleased to say that.
Yeah, it's interesting, at the MPO meeting on Monday, there was insertion of a $1 million project from Barnstable into the 2019 schedule based upon availability of funds all of a sudden. And so, you know, to the extent that we can have things design ready to move forward, sometimes there is space in the
Did they say what that million was for?
Yeah, Bursa's Way is the project, yeah. It may end up competing with funds for the intersection of Barnstable and Yarmouth. There's a major reconfiguration of that intersection, and if there's that project is a $9 million project, so if there's an overrun, potentially, it may compete with the other Barnstable project, but that money was allocated at this stage, so.
Yeah, so we're just starting now at the beginning of a long journey it'll be, so, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, but that's it.
Anything else? Anybody else have anything? Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Discussion, all's in favor?